Hello and welcome back. Tonight we are going to be talking about the complete Trojan Saga, which is Troy and the Odyssey. I really hope you enjoyed tonight's video. Please consider subscribing. Now onto the video. Tonight we're embarking on one of the most epic journeys through Greek mythology, the complete story of the Trojan War. This is a tale that has captivated audiences for nearly 3,000 years. A story of love and betrayal, of heroes and gods, of pride and vengeance, and of a war that would echo through the ages. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. The wedding that changed everything. Our story begins not with swords or ships, but with a celebration. High upon Mount Pelion, in a cave that opened onto slopes covered in pine and wild thyme, the centaur Chiron prepared to host the most magnificent wedding the world had ever seen. The groom was Peleus, a mortal hero of considerable renown, a man who had sailed with Jason and the Argonauts and proven himself worthy of glory. But the bride, she was something else entirely. Her name was Thetis, and she was a sea nymph, a Nereid, daughter of the ancient sea god Nereus. Her beauty was said to rival that of Aphrodite herself. Her silver voice could calm storms, and her grace in the water was unmatched by any creature above or below the waves. This was no ordinary union. In fact, it was a marriage born from fear. Both Zeus and Poseidon had desired Thetis, each god burning with passion for this immortal beauty. But a prophecy had been spoken, a warning whispered by Themis, the Titaness of divine law. Any child born to Thetis would grow to be greater than his father. Greater. That single word changed everything. Zeus, king of the gods, who had overthrown his own father Cronus, who ruled Olympus with thunderbolt in hand, could not risk a son who might one day cast him down. Poseidon, lord of the seas, felt the same dread, and so the gods made a decision. Thetis would marry a mortal. Her son would be mighty, yes, perhaps even the greatest of heroes, but he would be mortal. He would die. Peleus had not won Thetis easily. The gods told him he must capture her, but she was a shapeshifter, a creature of water and transformation. When he seized her on the shore, she became flame in his hands, burning bright and terrible. He held on. She became a serpent, coiling and hissing, fangs bared. He held on. She became a lioness, clawing and roaring. Still, he held on. She became rushing water, trying to slip between his fingers. But Peleus, patient and determined, never let go. Finally, exhausted and subdued, Thetis consented to become his bride. And so the wedding was arranged, and it was to be a celebration worthy of the ages. The gods themselves descended from Olympus to attend. Zeus came, and Hera beside him, queen of heaven, in all her glory. Poseidon arrived with gifts of immortal horses, their manes flowing like sea foam. Apollo brought his golden lyre, and the 9 muses gathered to sing. Athena presented a spear, its shaft of ash polished smooth, its blade forged by Hephaestus himself. Chiron, the wise centaur, offered his blessing and his cave as the site of the ceremony. The air was filled with divine light, with music that seemed to come from the very mountains themselves, with laughter and the scent of ambrosia. But there was one who had not been invited. Her name was Eris, and she was the goddess of discord, of strife, of chaos and conflict. Some say Zeus himself ordered that she be barred from the celebration, knowing that wherever Eris went, trouble followed. Others say it was simply an oversight, that in the planning of such a grand event, one small goddess was forgotten. Either way, the result was the same. Eris discovered that she alone among the immortals had been excluded, and her rage was terrible. She did not storm the gates. She did not shout or make threats. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She took a golden apple, perhaps plucked from the garden of the Hesperides, where such impossible fruits grew, and upon its gleaming surface, she inscribed 3 words in flowing Greek script. To the fairest. To the most beautiful one. Then, unseen and unheard, she appeared at the wedding feast just long enough to toss the apple into the midst of the celebrating gods. It rolled across the floor, glinting in the divine light, those 3 words catching every eye. The music stopped, the laughter died, and 3 goddesses, 3 of the most powerful beings in existence, each reached for the apple at the same moment. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, protector of marriage and childbirth, her eyes blazing with royal authority, claimed it first. The apple was clearly meant for her. Who else commanded such respect? Who else wore the crown of heaven? But Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, born from Zeus's own head in full armor, stepped forward with equal certainty. Wisdom was the highest virtue, strategy the greatest power. Clearly, she was the fairest. And then Aphrodite, born from sea foam where Uranus's severed flesh had fallen, goddess of love and beauty and desire itself, smiled that smile that had toppled kingdoms and said softly that the apple could only be meant for her. Was she not beauty incarnate? Did not all who looked upon her feel their hearts stir and their reason flee? The 3 goddesses stood there, each holding a corner of the golden apple, and the air between them crackled with divine fury. Zeus, looking at his wife, his daughter, and the goddess whose power even he respected, did what any wise husband and king would do. He refused to judge. He declared that such a decision was beyond even the king of gods, that to choose one would be to insult the others, and that the judgment must be made by someone else entirely, that someone would be a mortal, a young man, far from Olympus, tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida near the great city of Troy. His name was Paris, though he did not yet know what that name would come to mean. The Shepherd Prince and the Choice that Doomed a World. Paris was, in many ways, an unremarkable young man. He was handsome, yes, with dark curling hair and the kind of easy grace that came from years spent outdoors. He played the shepherd's flute well enough to charm his flocks, and occasionally the nymphs who dwelt in the mountain springs. He was gentle with lambs, skilled at finding lost sheep, content with bread and cheese and the simple life. But he was no simple shepherd, though he did not know it yet. He had been born in Troy, in the palace of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, born a prince to one of the wealthiest cities in the known world. But before his birth, Hecuba had dreamed a terrible dream. She dreamed that she gave birth not to a child, but to a burning torch, a flame that spread and spread until all of Troy was consumed, until the great walls cracked and crumbled, until nothing remained but ash and smoke and the screams of the dying. The royal seers interpreted the dream immediately. This child, they said, would be the doom of Troy. He must not be allowed to live. And so, when Paris was born, Priam made the hard decision that kings sometimes must make. He gave the infant to a trusted servant with orders to take the child far into the mountains and leave him there to die. The servant climbed high, found a lonely spot among the rocks, and laid the baby down. But he could not watch the child die. He left, telling himself that at least it would be quick, that the cold or a wolf would find the infant before suffering lasted too long. But Paris did not die. In one account, a she-bear whose own cubs had been lost heard his cries and came to investigate, nursing and protecting the infant until shepherds found him days later. Whether saved by a bear or simply discovered by the shepherds themselves, the boy survived when he should not have. The shepherds, finding him alive and healthy, took it as a sign from the gods. They raised him as one of their own, never knowing he was a prince of Troy, never telling him of walls and palaces and prophecies. Paris grew to manhood on those mountains, believing himself the son of shepherds, content with his lot in life. He was known for his good looks and his fairness of judgment. Once, when the god Ares disguised himself as a bull and competed with Paris's own best bull, Paris awarded the prize to the god without hesitation, recognizing that the better animal should win regardless of who owned it. This act of honest judgment did not go unnoticed on Olympus. So when Zeus decreed that a mortal must judge between the three goddesses, when he needed someone known for fair dealing and untainted by the politics of gods, the choice fell upon Paris. Hermes, the messenger god with his winged sandals and quick wit, was dispatched to bring the goddesses to Mount Ida, to this young shepherd who would decide the fate of the divine apple and, though he did not know it, the fate of thousands. Imagine the moment. Paris was alone on the mountain slopes, his flock grazing peacefully, the afternoon sun warm on his face. Suddenly the air shimmered, and there stood Hermes, grinning in that way he had, and behind him 3 figures of such radiance that Paris had to shield his eyes. These were not mortal women. These were goddesses, and the power that rolled off them made the very grass bend and the sheep scatter in instinctive terror. Hermes explained the situation with characteristic brevity. Zeus had appointed Paris as judge. The goddesses would each make their case. Paris would award the apple to the one he deemed most beautiful, most deserving. Simple enough. Except that nothing involving goddesses was ever simple. Each goddess, understanding that this was no mere beauty contest, but a question of honor and precedent that would echo through eternity, came prepared to offer more than just their appearance. They came with bribes. Hera went first, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of empires. She offered Paris power beyond imagining, promising to make him ruler over all of Asia, or in some versions, king of all lands, commander of vast territories, before whom nations would bow. She would give him wealth immeasurable, respect and authority that few mortals ever knew. All he had to do was declare her the fairest and give her the golden apple. Then Athena stepped forward, and her grey eyes seemed to see into Paris's very soul. She offered him victory in all conflicts, wisdom that would make him renowned throughout the ages, skill in battle that would make him unbeatable. She would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived, honored in song, remembered forever. She would give him the strategic mind to overcome any enemy, the cleverness to solve any problem, the glory that came from achievement earned through skill rather than mere fortune. The apple, she said, should clearly be hers. Finally, Aphrodite approached, and when she smiled, something in Paris's chest tightened. Her voice was honey and silk, her presence intoxicating. She did not speak of power or wisdom or victory in war. She spoke of something simpler and infinitely more dangerous. She would give him, she said, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Not just any woman, but the most beautiful. Helen of Sparta, whose face could launch 1,000 ships, whose beauty was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones from Egypt to Thrace. She would be his, Aphrodite promised. She would love him, and he would know joy beyond any that mortals typically experienced. All for a golden apple. Paris stood there, a shepherd who had never left his mountain, being offered the choice between dominion, glory, and love. He thought of ruling kingdoms, of responsibilities and politics, and the weight of crowns. He thought of battlefields, of blood and screaming, and the hard path of a warrior. And he thought of love, of this woman Helen, whom he had never seen, but whose name conjured images of impossible beauty. He was young, he was romantic, he had never wanted power or cared much for glory. He chose love. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. The goddess's smile widened, triumphant and knowing. She had won. But in that moment, Paris had made enemies of 2 of the most powerful goddesses in existence. Hera's face went cold as marble, her eyes promising vengeance. Athena's expression became hard as iron, calculating. They would remember this insult. They would never forget. And Troy, though Paris did not yet know it, was doomed. But all Paris could think about was this woman, this Helen, and the promise that she would be his. The goddesses departed, leaving him alone once more with his sheep and his dreams. Hermes took the golden apple and vanished, and far away, in Sparta, Helen of Sparta, most beautiful woman in the world, wife of King Menelaus, had no idea that her fate had just been sealed by a shepherd's choice on a distant mountain. The gears of destiny had begun to turn. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis, meant to be a celebration, had planted the seeds of the greatest war the ancient world would ever know. Now, Helen, the woman who would launch 1,000 ships. To understand what happened next, you must understand Helen. She was not simply beautiful in the way that pretty women are admired. Helen's beauty was something else entirely, something that transcended mere physical attraction and entered the realm of the divine. Poets would struggle for centuries to capture it in words. They would speak of her face that could launch 1,000 ships, of her luminous skin, of eyes that held the depths of the sea, of hair like spun gold, of a grace in movement that made men forget to breathe. But even these descriptions fell short, because Helen's beauty was touched by the divine. She was, after all, the daughter of Zeus himself. Her mother was Leda, queen of Sparta, but on one fateful night, Zeus had come to her in the form of a swan. From that union came eggs, as strange as that sounds, and from those eggs came children. Helen and her sister Clytemnestra, and her brothers Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, the divine twins. Helen inherited divinity from her father, though she remained mortal. That divine blood gave her beauty that was simply beyond human comprehension. As she grew from a girl into a young woman, her beauty became known throughout Greece. By the time she reached marriageable age, suitors came from every corner of the Greek world. They came from powerful city-states and small kingdoms, from islands and mainlands, from near and far. These were not mere fortune hunters. These were kings and princes and heroes, men of power and wealth in their own right. Men who wanted Helen not for any advantage she might bring, but simply because the idea of possessing such beauty became an obsession. Her mortal father, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, faced an impossible dilemma. He had dozens of suitors, each powerful, each expecting to be chosen. If he selected one, the others would be insulted. Wars had been fought over, less. Greece could tear itself apart over this single woman. Tyndareus lay awake at night, trying to find a solution that would not end in blood. It was Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, who provided the answer. Odysseus himself was there as a suitor, though he knew his chances were slim. He was not the wealthiest, not the most powerful, not even close. But he was shrewd, and he saw an opportunity. He went to Tyndareus with a proposal. He would solve the problem of the suitors, he said, if Tyndareus would in turn help him win the hand of Penelope, Tyndareus's niece. The king agreed immediately. Odysseus's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Before Tyndareus chose a husband for Helen, all the suitors must swear a sacred oath. They would swear to accept whoever was chosen. More than that, they would swear to defend Helen's marriage. If anyone at all, should ever try to steal Helen away or dishonor the chosen husband, all the suitors would unite to punish the offender and retrieve Helen. They would be bound by honor and by the most sacred vows a Greek could make. Blood would bind them, oaths witnessed by the gods themselves. One by one, the suitors agreed. They had to. To refuse would be to admit cowardice, to show that one's word meant nothing. And so they swore, each man cutting his palm and letting the blood drip onto the earth, calling on Zeus and the other gods to witness their vow and to strike them down if they should break it. Odysseus swore it. Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, swore it. Ajax the great, towering warrior, swore it. Diomedes, Patroclus, all the great heroes and kings of Greece bound themselves with words that could not be taken back. Then Tyndareus made his choice. He selected Menelaus, younger brother of Agamemnon, a prince of Mycenae who had recently become king of Sparta through marriage alliances and political maneuvering. Menelaus was not the most charismatic of the suitors, perhaps, but he was wealthy, powerful, connected to the most important family in Greece, and by all accounts a decent man. Helen accepted the match. Whether she loved Menelaus or merely accepted her father's choice, the sources do not entirely agree. But the marriage was made, and Menelaus became king of Sparta, with Helen as his queen. For several years, they ruled peacefully. They had a daughter, Hermione, and by all accounts, their household was prosperous and well-ordered. Menelaus treated Helen well, showered her with gifts, gave her honor and respect. She presided over the palace, welcomed guests with proper hospitality, performed the duties of a Spartan queen. Life seemed settled, stable, content enough, though whether Helen was truly happy or simply resigned to her circumstances, we cannot know. But fate and the gods had other plans. Aphrodite had made a promise to a shepherd on Mount Ida, and Aphrodite always kept her promises, especially when it came to matters of love and desire. Paris did not remain a shepherd forever. One day, athletic games were held in Troy, and Paris, hearing of them, descended from his mountain to compete. He excelled, beating prince after prince of Troy in various contests. Hector, the eldest son of Priam and heir to Troy's throne, grew suspicious of this shepherd who moved with such grace and fought with such skill. Questions were asked. The servant who had been ordered to expose the infant on the mountain was found, and the truth came out. Paris was no shepherd. He was Priam's son, a prince of Troy who had survived against all odds. Priam, overjoyed to discover that his son lived, dismissed the old prophecy. Seers could be wrong, he told himself. The dream had been just a dream. He welcomed Paris back into the palace, dressed him in royal robes, gave him a place of honor. Paris, who had known only mountains and sheep, suddenly found himself a prince of one of the richest cities in the world. It was in this capacity, as a prince of Troy, that Paris was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sparta. Troy and Sparta had connections going back generations, trade agreements, friendly relations. Paris would be an ambassador, cementing ties, discussing matters of mutual interest. Priam sent him with rich gifts and instructions to comport himself with the dignity befitting a Trojan prince. Menelaus received the Trojan prince with all the honors due to a royal guest. The laws of hospitality, of Xenia, were sacred to the Greeks. A guest in one's home was protected by Zeus himself. Menelaus welcomed Paris, gave him rooms in the palace, invited him to feast at his table. Some traditions hold that Menelaus then had to travel to Crete for his grandfather Catreus's funeral, leaving Paris alone with Helen, an absence the Trojan prince exploited. Other accounts suggest Paris acted even while Menelaus remained in Sparta, though the mechanics of this are less clear. What is certain is that Paris found himself in proximity to the woman Aphrodite had promised him. And there, across the flickering light of torches and oil lamps, Paris saw Helen for the first time. The ancient sources themselves cannot agree on exactly what happened next, and perhaps that disagreement reflects the complexity of the event. Some traditions say that Aphrodite, keeping her promise to Paris, struck Helen with overwhelming desire. The goddess or her son Eros compelled Helen's heart, and suddenly the queen of Sparta could think of nothing but this Trojan prince. Other accounts suggest Helen went willingly, genuinely falling in love, drawn to Paris's charm and the promise of adventure beyond her predictable life as a Spartan queen. Still other versions, particularly those sympathetic to Menelaus, claim Helen was abducted outright, taken against her will, that Paris violated the sacred laws of hospitality by stealing his host's wife. The truth, if we can speak of truth in mythology, likely contains shades of all these versions. What we know for certain is that Helen left Sparta with Paris. Whether she was compelled by divine power beyond her ability to resist, genuinely chose love over duty, or was taken by force, the ancient poets themselves debated. This ambiguity would follow Helen throughout the war and beyond. Whatever the exact mechanism of her departure, whether divine compulsion, genuine choice, or abduction, the result was the same. Paris and Helen left Sparta together. They fled in the night, taking with them treasures from Menelaus's palace, gold and jewels that would later be cited as theft alongside the alleged theft of a wife. Various sources claim they had children together during their time in Troy, though these accounts differ widely and may reflect later elaborations on the core story. What matters is that when Menelaus returned to find his wife gone, his palace plundered, his honor destroyed, his rage was apocalyptic. This was not merely infidelity. This was the violation of Xenia, one of the most sacred laws of Greek society. A guest had betrayed his host. A prince had stolen a queen. Paris had not only taken the most beautiful woman in the world, but had done so in the most dishonorable way imaginable. Menelaus went immediately to his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, ruler of Mycenae, commander of the strongest military forces in the Greek world. The brothers had been close since childhood, bound not just by blood, but by shared ambition. Agamemnon listened to his brother's story and understood immediately that this was bigger than one man's wounded pride. This was about honor, about the sacred laws that held Greek civilization together, about showing the world that you could not insult the Greek kings and escape unpunished. More than that, Agamemnon remembered the oath of Tyndareus. Every major king and hero in Greece had sworn to defend Helen's marriage. The oath had been witnessed by the gods. To ignore it now would be to break sacred vows, to invite divine punishment, to show oneself as oathbreaker and coward. Agamemnon sent messengers racing across Greece, calling in the oath, summoning the heroes who had sworn to defend Helen and her marriage. And one by one, though some reluctantly, though some tried to escape their obligation, the heroes of Greece began to gather. They gathered at Aulis, a port on the eastern coast of Greece, bringing their ships and their men, their weapons and their supplies. An army was assembling, the greatest military force Greece had ever mustered. They would sail to Troy. They would bring Helen back. They would punish Paris for his crime. And if Troy refused to give her up, they would burn the city to the ground. The Trojan War was about to begin, all because of a wedding, a golden apple, and the most beautiful woman in the world. The gathering storm. Heroes answer the call. The assembly at Aulis was like nothing Greece had ever seen before. Ships lined the harbour, hundreds of them, their dark hulls rising from the water like a forest of wood and rope. Each ship belonged to a different king or prince. Each brought warriors bound by oath and honour. The beach became a vast encampment, tents spreading as far as the eye could see, smoke from cooking fires rising into the sky, the air filled with the sounds of men preparing for war. They came from every corner of the Greek world. From Mycenae came Agamemnon himself, commanding the largest contingent, the richest supplies, the most disciplined troops. He established himself as commander of the entire expedition, and none challenged his authority. His ships numbered over 100, and his men were veterans of countless campaigns. Agamemnon had waited his entire life for an opportunity like this, a chance to lead such a force, to conquer a city as wealthy as Troy, to cement his place in history as the greatest king Greece had ever known. From Sparta came Menelaus, of course, bringing every warrior he could muster. His motivation was personal, his rage barely contained. While other kings might have political or economic reasons for wanting to sack Troy, Menelaus burned with the fury of a man dishonored, a husband wronged. He spoke to the assembled leaders of his shame, of how Paris had betrayed sacred hospitality, of how Helen must be returned. Some saw his pain and sympathized. Others saw opportunity and planned accordingly. From Ithaca came Odysseus, though he had tried desperately to avoid going. When the messengers arrived to call in his oath, Odysseus had pretended to be mad, yoking an ox and a donkey together and ploughing his fields with salt, acts so irrational they could only be those of a madman. But Palamedes, one of the Greek heroes known for his own cleverness, suspected trickery. He placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus directly in the path of the plough. Odysseus, unable to maintain the pretense when faced with harm to his child, swerved the plough aside at the last moment, proving his sanity and revealing his deception. Caught in his ruse, Odysseus had no choice but to honor his oath. He came to Aulis with a dozen ships and men known for their cleverness and resourcefulness rather than their brute strength. He would never forgive Palamedes for exposing his trick, and that grudge would later have tragic consequences during the war itself. From Pylos came old Nestor, the wisest of the Greeks, a man who had lived through 3 generations and whose memories reached back to the age of centaurs and the hunt for the Caledonian boar, whose advice was valued above all others. His hair was white as sea foam, his back bent with age, but his mind remained sharp as any blade, and his experience in council and combat was unmatched. The young warriors respected him. The kings sought his counsel. When Nestor spoke, everyone listened. From Salamis came Ajax, son of Telamon, a giant of a man, towering over other warriors, massively strong, nearly invincible in battle. He wore armor that seemed more like a fortress than clothing, and he carried a shield large as a door. In direct combat, Ajax feared no one, and his mere presence inspired courage in his allies and terror in his enemies. His ships brought warriors who matched him in courage, if not in size, men who would follow Ajax into any battle without hesitation. From Phthia came a contingent led by an older warrior, but the real prize was a young man who had been hidden away. This was Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the child born from that wedding where all this had begun. Thetis, knowing that her son was destined to die if he went to Troy, had disguised him as a girl and hidden him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Syros. But Odysseus, always clever, discovered the deception. He came to the court disguised as a merchant, displaying jewelry and fine cloth to the young women, but among his wares he also placed weapons and armor. When a trumpet suddenly blared, as if announcing an attack, one of the maidens immediately reached not for the jewelry, but for the spear and shield. Achilles was revealed. The young man who came to Aulis was barely more than a boy, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, but he moved with a grace and confidence that made seasoned warriors step back. His hair was golden red, his eyes fierce, his body already showing the muscle and agility that would make him the greatest warrior of his generation. He brought with him the Myrmidons, warriors loyal to his father, but more importantly, he brought a presence, an intensity that changed the very atmosphere of the camp. Men whispered that he was half divine, that his mother was a goddess. They whispered that he was destined for greatness. They did not yet know that he was destined to die young, to burn bright and brief like a falling star. With Achilles came Patroclus, his closest companion. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated since ancient times. Homer's Iliad portrays them as extraordinarily close friends and comrades, though without explicit romantic details. Later Greek writers, including the playwright Aeschylus and the philosopher Plato, interpreted their bond as a romantic one. Whether they were lovers or simply possessed a friendship so deep it transcended ordinary bonds, what is undeniable is that Patroclus was Achilles' most important person. Where Achilles burned with rage and pride, Patroclus was gentle, empathetic, concerned for others. They balanced each other, and neither could imagine life without the other. From Argos came Diomedes, young but already renowned for his courage and skill. From Crete came King Idomeneus, with a large fleet. From Phocis came the lesser Ajax, swift and fierce. Hero after hero, king after king, each bringing their ships and their men, each bound by the oath they had sworn years ago when they had competed for Helen's hand. But there was one crucial absence. Achilles was there, but he had come reluctantly, knowing somehow that Troy meant his doom, and one notable refusal. Cinyras of Cyprus sent only one real ship, and 49 ships made of clay, a mockery of his obligation, though he was too distant for the Greeks to punish immediately. The army gathered, but they could not sail. Day after day, they waited at Aulis, and the winds remained contrary. The ship sat motionless, going nowhere, while supplies dwindled and men grew restless. Agamemnon consulted the seer Calchas, who delivered devastating news. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, was angry. Some say Agamemnon had killed a sacred deer in her grove and boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. Others say she was simply allied with the Trojans and opposed the expedition. Regardless of the reason, her anger manifested in still winds and calm seas. No amount of prayer or sacrifice changed anything. Calchas revealed what Artemis demanded. She wanted a sacrifice, but not of goats or bulls. She wanted a royal sacrifice. She wanted Agamemnon's eldest daughter, Iphigenia. The king must choose between his daughter and his ambition, between his family and his glory. Agamemnon stood on the shore, watching the motionless ships, feeling the eyes of the entire army on him. His brother wanted vengeance. The kings wanted to sail. The men wanted to fight. Greece wanted war. And all he had to do was sacrifice his daughter. He made his choice. He sent word to Mycenae, to his wife Clytemnestra, telling her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis. He lied, saying that Achilles had asked to marry the girl, that she should come for her wedding. Clytemnestra, proud and delighted, brought her daughter to what she thought would be a celebration. The truth revealed itself too late. Different traditions tell different ends to this story. In some, Iphigenia went willingly to the altar once she understood, choosing to sacrifice herself for Greece with courage that humbled the hardened warriors watching. In others, she struggled and screamed as the knife descended. In yet another version, one that later Greeks preferred, Artemis was satisfied merely with Iphigenia's willingness to die and replaced the girl at the final moment with a deer, spiriting the princess away to serve as a priestess in distant Tauris. But whether Iphigenia truly died or was saved by divine intervention, the damage was done. Blood was spilled. Artemis was appeased. The winds changed, coming strong from the west, filling the sails of the Greek ships. Clytemnestra, whether her daughter died or vanished, never forgave her husband. That murder, or near murder, would haunt Agamemnon. The price of war was paid not by warriors, but by an innocent girl. And the ships of Greece, over 1,000 strong, their sails billowing white against the blue Aegean sky, finally set sail for Troy. They crossed the sea, island hopping, maintaining formation, this vast armada carrying 10,000 warriors toward the distant shores of Asia Minor. At the prow of his flagship, Agamemnon looked east toward Timon, glory and gold. Beside him, Menelaus thought only of Helen. And somewhere in the fleet, young Achilles felt destiny settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, knowing he sailed toward a fate he could not escape. In Troy, watchmen on the great walls saw the horizon grow dark with sails. They sounded the alarm. The city prepared for war. And Paris, standing on the battlements with Helen beside him, watched the army that had come for them approach and wondered if love was worth this price. The Trojan War had begun. 9 years of blood and fire. The war did not end quickly. It could not. Troy was not some minor settlement that could be taken in a single assault. Troy was one of the most powerful cities in the known world, built on a hill with walls so thick and high that they seemed to touch the sky itself. Legend said that Poseidon and Apollo had built those walls in ages past, laying stone upon stone with divine precision. Whether built by gods or skilled masons, the walls were formidable, perhaps impregnable. They had never been breached by enemy forces, and the Trojans were confident they never would be. The Greek army made camp on the beach below the city, dragging their ships up onto the sand, building palisades and shelters, establishing a siege that would last not weeks or months, but years. The Trojans watched from their walls but did not venture out in force. They knew their advantage. Let the Greeks sit on the beach. Let them face the winter storms, the summer heat, the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across the Aegean. Let time and attrition do what Trojan spears could not. For 9 years, the war ground on. 9 years of small skirmishes, of raids on surrounding cities, of frustration and boredom punctuated by moments of violence. The Greeks could not breach the walls, but the Trojans could not dislodge the invaders. It became a test of endurance, of will, of who would break first. The beach became a semi-permanent settlement, with ramparts built to protect the ships, supply lines established back to Greece, and a whole economy of war developing around the siege. Achilles, young and hungry for glory, made his name during these years. Unable to assault Troy directly, he led raids on the cities allied to Troy, settlements along the coast and inland, cutting off Troy's support and supply. He was unstoppable in battle, moving with speed that seemed impossible, striking with force that seemed divine. His spear never missed, his sword never broke. Men fell before him like grain before the scythe. The ancient traditions claimed he sacked 23 cities in those 9 years, though the exact number may be poetic exaggeration. What is certain is that Achilles became the terror of the Trojan countryside, that cities learned to bar their gates at the mere rumor of his approach, that mothers invoked his name to frighten misbehaving children. It was during one of these raids that Achilles captured a woman named Briseis. She was from the city of Lyrnessus, and Achilles had killed her husband and brothers when the city fell. By the brutal customs of the time, she became his prize, his property, awarded to him as a mark of his achievement in battle. Whether Briseis and Achilles developed genuine affection for each other, or whether she was simply his captive, the sources are ambiguous. But she became important to him, more than just a trophy, perhaps the closest thing to normal human connection that Achilles allowed himself. In another raid, this one on the city of Thebes, Agamemnon claimed a different woman, Chryseis, daughter of Chrysis, a priest of Apollo. The war had created a system of distribution, where spoils were divided according to rank and contribution. The greatest prizes went to the greatest warriors, the commanders, the kings. Chryseis, beautiful and highborn, became Agamemnon's prize. But her father Chryses came to the Greek camp, bringing a ransom worthy of a king's daughter, begging for her return. He came as a suppliant, as a priest of Apollo, appealing to Greek piety and decency. Agamemnon, drunk on power and victory, refused him harshly. He mocked the old priest, threatened him, told him that Chryseis would die in slavery far from home. Chryses left the camp, but he did not leave quietly. On the beach, away from the Greek tents, he raised his hands to the sky and prayed to Apollo, begging the god to avenge this insult. Apollo heard. Apollo, god of plague and healing, of light and disease, sent a pestilence into the Greek camp. It started small, animals sickening and dying, livestock falling where they stood. Then the men began to die. They developed fevers, sores on their skin. They coughed blood and weakened and died by the dozen, by the 100. Funeral pyres burned day and night, the smoke rising into the sky, the air thick with death. The army, which had not been defeated by Trojan spears, was being destroyed by invisible arrows shot from Apollo's silver bow. Calchas the seer was consulted. He knew the cause, but he was afraid to speak. Finally, with Achilles promising to protect him from any retribution, Calchas revealed the truth. Agamemnon's refusal to return Chryseis had brought Apollo's wrath. Only by returning the girl to her father and making appropriate sacrifice could the plague be lifted. Agamemnon had no choice. Sick with rage but helpless against disease, he agreed to give up Chryseis. But he would not suffer this loss alone, would not be the only king forced to surrender his prize. If he lost Chryseis, then someone else must lose a prize of equal value, and the prize he chose was Briseis, claimed from Achilles. The meeting where this decision was announced became legendary. Achilles, already temperamental, already proud beyond measure, exploded with fury. Agamemnon was not just taking a woman, he was taking Achilles' honor, his time, his reward for being the greatest warrior in the army. It was an insult that could not be borne. Achilles called Agamemnon a coward, accused him of sitting safely in camp while others did the fighting, claimed that the commander took the best prizes while contributing the least. The argument escalated until Achilles nearly drew his sword right there in the council, prepared to kill the commander of the Greek forces. Only Athena's intervention stopped the murder. The goddess appeared, visible only to Achilles, grabbing his hair and pulling him back, reminding him that there were better ways to seek revenge than assassination. Achilles listened to the goddess, but his decision was made. He would not kill Agamemnon. He would do something worse. He would stop fighting. When Briseis was taken from his tent, when heralds came to claim her on Agamemnon's orders, Achilles did not resist. He let them take her, but he swore a terrible oath. He would not fight for the Greeks again. He would not lift a spear, would not draw his sword, would not lead the Myrmidons into battle. Let Agamemnon and the other Greeks face the Trojans alone. Let them die. Let them fail. Let them see what happened when they dishonored the greatest warrior who had ever lived. He retired to his tent with Patroclus, and there he stayed, playing his lyre, singing songs, refusing all entreaties to return. And his mother Thetis, hearing of her son's humiliation, went to Olympus to see Zeus. She had once saved Zeus from a rebellion of the other Olympians, binding the rebellious gods with the help of the 100-handed giant. Zeus owed her a debt, and she called it in now. She asked him to give victory to the Trojans, to make the Greeks suffer in Achilles' absence, to show them that they could not win without her son. Zeus agreed, swearing on the river Styx, the most binding oath a god could make. He would tilt the tide of war. The Trojans would prevail until Achilles returned, until the Greeks learned their lesson and gave Achilles the honor he deserved. And so the 9th year of the war became a nightmare for the Greeks. The Trojans, seeing that Achilles did not emerge from his tent, grew bold. They sallied out from the gates in force, led by Hector, Paris's older brother, and the greatest warrior Troy possessed. Hector was everything Paris was not: noble, honorable, brave, a man who fought for his city rather than for personal gain. He had opposed Paris's abduction of Helen from the start, had argued forcefully that she should be returned to avoid this very war. But once the war began, once Troy was besieged, once Greek blood soaked Trojan soil, Hector set aside his objections and became Troy's champion, its shield, its best hope for survival. He was a complete warrior in ways that even Achilles was not. Where Achilles fought with rage and superhuman skill, Hector fought with discipline, strategy, and a soldier's understanding of warfare. He knew every man in his forces by name, cared for their welfare, inspired loyalty not through fear but through respect. His wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax gave him something to fight for beyond mere glory. When he walked through Troy's streets, people touched him for luck, whispered prayers for his safety, saw in him the personification of their city's resistance. With Zeus's favor, the Trojans drove the Greeks back toward their ships. Heroes fell. The great Ajax held the line again and again, his shield taking blow after blow, but even he could not be everywhere. The Trojans set fire to the Greek ships, threatening to destroy the entire fleet, to leave the Greeks stranded on the beach with no way home, no choice but death or surrender. Agamemnon, desperate, sent an embassy to Achilles. He chose 3 men carefully: Odysseus, known for his silver tongue and persuasive abilities; Ajax the Great, the second best warrior after Achilles himself, a man whose straightforward honesty might appeal to the sulking hero; and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, the man who had helped raise him, someone who could appeal to emotion and memory. They went to his tent bearing incredible gifts, treasures so vast they defied imagination. Agamemnon's offer was extraordinary. He would return Briseis, untouched and honored, swearing a public oath that he had never taken her to his bed. Along with her would come 7 other women, skilled in crafts, beautiful and unblemished. He offered vast amounts of gold, more tripods and cauldrons than could easily be counted, 12 prize horses that had won races, 7 cities on the coast of the Peloponnese to rule as Achilles saw fit, each with their own income and resources. He even offered one of his own daughters in marriage, whichever Achilles preferred, with a dowry beyond measure, and the promise that Achilles' father Peleus would be honored as if he were Agamemnon's own father. It was a king's ransom, offered to heal a wounded pride. The embassy made their case eloquently, appealing to honor, to duty, to the memory of comrades dying on the battlefield, to the glory that awaited if Achilles would just set aside his anger and fight. Achilles refused. His pride was too wounded, his rage too deep. He told them he would sail home in the morning, take his myrmidons, and leave the Greeks to their fate. Better to live a long, quiet life than to die for the glory of men who had dishonored him. Phoenix wept. Ajax spoke of shame. Odysseus employed every rhetorical trick he knew. Nothing worked. The embassy returned empty-handed, and the Greeks prepared for disaster. It was Patroclus who finally broke the impasse, though not in the way anyone wanted. Gentle Patroclus, watching Greeks die while his friend sulked in his tent, could bear it no longer. He went to Achilles with tears in his eyes and begged his friend to act. If Achilles would not fight himself, Patroclus asked, then let him wear Achilles' armor. Let him lead the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans would see the famous armor and think Achilles had returned. It would buy time, give the Greeks a chance to survive. Achilles, moved by his friend's distress, but still too proud to fight himself, agreed. He helped Patroclus put on his armor, the bronze that gleamed like sunlight, the helmet with its horsehair crest, the shield that had turned aside so many spears. He gave Patroclus his chariot, driven by divine horses gifted by Poseidon. But he made Patroclus promise one thing: drive the Trojans back from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls. Do not try to assault Troy. Push them back and then return. Promise me. Patroclus promised. He rode out at the head of the Myrmidons, fresh troops eager for battle, and the Trojans recoiled in terror when they saw what they thought was Achilles returning to the fight. The tide of battle turned immediately. Patroclus fought with skill and courage, killing Trojan after Trojan, even slaying Sarpedon, a son of Zeus who had come to aid Troy. The Greeks rallied. The Trojans fled. But Patroclus, in the heat of battle, in the intoxication of victory, forgot his promise. He pursued the fleeing Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy. 3 times he tried to scale the walls, and 3 times Apollo himself intervened, pushing him back. And then, in the chaos of combat, with gods and men mingled in violence, Patroclus's moment came to an end. Apollo, protecting Troy, struck Patroclus, dazing him. A Trojan warrior named Euphorbus, seeing the opening, drove his spear into Patroclus's back, and then Hector, seeing the greatest warrior of the Greeks, stunned and wounded, delivered the killing blow. His spear pierced through armor and into Patroclus's body, and Achilles' dear friend fell, dying in the dust before the walls of Troy. As he died, Patroclus gasped out a prophecy. Hector would not long survive this victory, he said. Achilles would come for revenge, and Hector himself would fall beneath the same walls where Patroclus now lay dying. Hector, breathing hard, retrieved Achilles' armor from Patroclus's body and claimed it as his prize. The battle raged on over the corpse, Greeks desperate to recover their hero's body, Trojans equally determined to take it as a trophy. Finally, Ajax and Menelaus fought their way to Patroclus, lifted him, and carried him back toward the ships while others covered their retreat. Back in his tent, Achilles knew. Some say his horses spoke, warning him. Some say a messenger came. Some say he simply felt it, a sudden knowledge that something terrible had happened. When the truth was confirmed, When they brought Patroclus's body back to camp and laid it before him, Achilles' grief was apocalyptic. He screamed, a sound that echoed across the battlefield, that was heard in Troy, that seemed to shake the very ground. He tore his hair, covered himself in ash, refused to eat or drink. His mother Thetis came from her home in the sea and found him weeping over the body, and she knew that this meant the end. Because if Patroclus was dead, Achilles would seek revenge. And if Achilles sought revenge against Hector, then Achilles himself would die soon after. It was prophesied. Achilles' fate was sealed. But Achilles did not care about prophecies anymore. He did not care about his own life, about living to old age. All he cared about was making Hector pay. The war was about to enter its final, bloodiest phase. Achilles was coming back, and no one, not Agamemnon, not Hector, not Troy itself, would stop him. The greatest warrior who had ever lived was about to write his name in blood across the plains of Troy, and before he was done, the course of the war would be changed forever. The wrath of Achilles. Thetis knew she could not stop her son. She had always known this day would come, the day when Achilles would choose glory over long life, when he would embrace his fate and burn bright and brief like a falling star. But she could at least give him the tools he would need. She went to Olympus, to the forge of Hephaestus, god of metalworking and fire, and she begged him to make new armor for Achilles. The old armor, the armor Patroclus had worn, was now on Hector's back, claimed as a prize of war. Hephaestus, the lame god with hands more skilled than any craftsman who had ever lived, agreed immediately. Thetis had been kind to him once, when Hera had cast him from Olympus in disgust at his deformity. Thetis and another sea nymph had caught him, cared for him, given him shelter. He would not forget that kindness. For Achilles, son of Thetis, he would make armor such as no mortal had ever worn. He worked through the night, the flames of his forge burning hotter than any earthly fire, his hammers ringing against bronze and gold and silver. He made a breastplate that would turn any spear. He made greaves that fit perfectly. He made a helmet with a crest of horsehair that would make Achilles seem taller, more terrible. But the shield was his masterpiece. It was enormous, layered, decorated with scenes hammered into the metal. He depicted the earth and the sky and the sea, the sun and moon and stars. He showed cities at peace and cities at war, farmers harvesting their fields, shepherds tending flocks, dancers celebrating marriages, soldiers dying on battlefields. He showed the beauty and tragedy of human existence, the fullness of life, all on a shield meant to protect a man who had chosen death over dishonor. When dawn broke, Thetis brought the armor to her son. Achilles was still sitting with Patroclus's body, refusing to let them prepare it for cremation, speaking to his dead friend as though he could still hear. But when he saw the armor, when he held the shield and felt its weight, something shifted in him. This was not just equipment. This was his fate made manifest, destiny hammered into bronze. He stood, the armor gleaming on him like the sun itself, and he walked out of his tent. The entire Greek army fell silent, watching this transformation. Achilles had been fearsome before. Now he was terrifying, a figure of wrath and divine power, barely human anymore. He went to the assembly, to where Agamemnon and the other kings met, and he renounced his anger publicly, not because he forgave Agamemnon, not because the insult no longer mattered, but because none of that was important anymore. Patroclus was dead. Only revenge mattered now. Agamemnon, sensing the shift, quickly offered to return Briseis as promised, along with all the other gifts he had pledged. Achilles accepted without even looking at them. He did not want treasure. He wanted blood. They cremated Patroclus that night, building a pyre higher than any that had burned before, surrounding it with the bodies of sacrificed animals, with wine and oil and precious things. Achilles cut a lock of his own hair and placed it on his friend's chest. He promised that he would not rest, would not sleep, would not eat until Hector was dead and dragged through the dust. Then they lit the fire, and the flames rose high into the night sky, carrying Patroclus' spirit to whatever afterlife awaited. At dawn, Achilles armed himself and went to war. What followed was slaughter on a scale the war had not yet seen. Achilles carved through the Trojan forces like a storm, like a force of nature beyond stopping. He killed and killed and killed. The river, Scamander, began to choke on corpses, its waters running red with blood. The river god himself rose up, angered at the pollution, and attacked Achilles, trying to drown him with waves and current. But Achilles fought even the river, and Hephaestus intervened, boiling the waters with fire until the river god retreated. Nothing could stop Achilles. Trojans fled before him, scrambling for the gates of the city. King Priam and Queen Hecuba watched from the walls in horror as their warriors died, as this Greek demon cut down their sons and brothers and husbands. But one Trojan did not run. One warrior stood before the Scaean gates, refusing to retreat into safety. Hector, who had killed Patroclus. Hector, who wore Achilles' old armor. Hector, knowing that his city needed someone to stand, that someone had to face this terror or Troy would fall. His wife Andromache had begged him not to go out. His infant son Astyanax had reached for him with chubby hands. His parents had pleaded from the walls, but Hector was Troy's champion, and he could not hide while his city burned. When Achilles saw Hector standing there, saw his own armor on the man who had killed his friend, something in him transcended rage and entered a cold, focused clarity. This was what he had been waiting for. This was why he had been born, why his mother had dipped him in the Styx, why he had come to Troy knowing he would die. This moment, this fight, this vengeance. But when they faced each other, Hector's courage wavered. He looked into Achilles' eyes and saw not a man, but something else. Something beyond human. Something touched by gods and fate and death itself. Hector ran. The greatest warrior of Troy, the man who had held the city together for 9 years, turned and fled, and Achilles pursued him. 3 times they ran around the walls of Troy, the pursued and the pursuer, all of Troy watching from above, all of Greece watching from the plain below. Hector tried every trick, every tactic, but he could not shake Achilles, could not reach the gates. Finally, with Athena's intervention, appearing to Hector as one of his brothers and promising to help him fight, Hector stopped running and turned to face his doom. They fought with spears first, hurling them at each other. Hector's spear struck Achilles' divine shield and bounced away. Achilles' spear missed, but was returned to him by Athena, invisible beside him. They drew swords and clashed, bronze ringing against bronze. But Hector was tired from running, and the armor he wore, Achilles' own armor, was known intimately by Achilles himself. Achilles knew where the gaps were, where the weak points lay. His spear found the gap at Hector's throat, above the collarbone, below the helmet. It punched through, and Hector fell, gasping, dying in the dust before his own city gates. As the light left his eyes, Hector begged Achilles to return his body to Troy for proper burial. But Achilles, beyond mercy, beyond humanity, refused. Instead, he did something that shocked even his own allies. He tied Hector's ankles to his chariot and dragged the body around the walls of Troy, again and again, while Priam and Hecuba and all of Troy watched in horror. Andromache fainted on the walls. The Trojans wept, and Achilles, filled with a grief that could not be satisfied by simple death, continued to desecrate the corpse, dragging it behind his chariot day after day, refusing to let Troy have their hero back. But the gods protected Hector's body from corruption, and finally they had had enough of this violation. Zeus sent a message to Thetis, and Thetis went to her son and told him that the gods commanded he return the body. More than that, she told him that his own death was close now, that Paris and Apollo would soon end his life. She begged him to let go of his rage, to accept the ransom that would be offered, to show some mercy before it was too late. That night, Priam made a decision that only a father could make. Guided by Hermes, the old king of Troy left his city alone, unarmed, and went to the Greek camp, to Achilles' tent. He, who had lost so many sons to this war, who had watched his eldest be dragged through the dust, went to the man who had done this and knelt before him. He kissed Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed Hector, and he begged for his son's body. He spoke as a father to another man who had a father, reminded Achilles of Peleus far away in Greece, who might one day need someone to show him mercy. He offered treasure, a ransom worthy of kings, and he wept. Achilles, looking at this old man whose grief mirrored his own, who had lost just as he had lost, felt something crack inside him. He thought of his own father, whom he would never see again. He thought of Patroclus, whose death had set all this in motion. He thought of the futility of rage, of the way violence only bred more violence, of how everyone, Greek and Trojan alike, was trapped in this nightmare from which there was no escape. He accepted the ransom. He ordered his men to wash and prepare Hector's body, to dress it in fine cloth, to treat it with respect. He shared food with Priam, though they sat in silence, former enemies momentarily united in their shared sorrow. And when Priam left at dawn, carrying his son's body back to Troy, Achilles did not try to stop him. He granted a truce, 12 days for Troy to mourn and cremate Hector properly, 12 days where no fighting would occur. Troy mourned their fallen champion, with all the ceremony and grief such a hero deserved. And in the Greek camp, Achilles sat and waited for his own death, which he knew was coming soon. He had achieved his vengeance. He had done what he came to Troy to do. Now there was nothing left but to die gloriously, as had been prophesied from the beginning. But there were still events to unfold before Achilles met his end, still moves to be made in this deadly game between mortals and gods. The deaths of heroes and the wooden horse. After Hector's funeral, the war resumed, but something had changed. The Trojans had lost their greatest defender. The Greeks had proven that even Troy's mightiest could fall. But Troy still stood, its walls unbreached, its gates barred. The stalemate, though tilted now in favor of the Greeks, continued. Troy called for aid from its allies, and they came. From the kingdom of the Amazons rode Queen Penthesilea, leading her warrior women, fierce fighters who had trained since childhood in the arts of combat. They wore light armor, carried crescent shields, and moved with a speed and agility that caught the Greeks off guard. Penthesilea herself was magnificent, beautiful, and terrible in battle, cutting through Greek ranks with her double-headed axe. But she met Achilles, and the outcome was inevitable. He killed her in single combat, his spear piercing through her armor and into her heart. And as he pulled off her helmet, seeing her face as she died, Achilles felt a pang of regret, perhaps even love, for this woman he had just killed. She had been brave, she had been worthy, and she was dead because she had stood against him. From Ethiopia came King Memnon, son of the dawn goddess Eos, leading warriors from the mysterious east. Memnon was said to be nearly Achilles' equal, a hero touched by divinity, armored by Hephaestus himself. Their duel was epic, watched by gods and men, two champions fighting at the pinnacle of their abilities. But Achilles prevailed, as he always did, and Memnon fell. His mother Eos wept, and her tears became the morning dew. But Achilles' time was running short. Paris, lurking behind the battle lines, drawing his bow with hands that trembled between fear and hatred, waited for his moment. He had been cursed by the Greeks as a coward, as the man who had caused the war through lust and treachery, as someone who skulked behind walls while braver men died. But he had one skill, one talent that made him dangerous. He was an archer, and Apollo favored him. The sources differ on exactly how it happened. In some versions, Achilles was simply fighting before the gates when Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, found its mark. In others, Achilles had fallen in love with Polyxena, Paris's sister, and was lured to the temple of Apollo for a supposed peace negotiation or marriage discussion, only to be ambushed. But the result was always the same. Paris's arrow struck Achilles in the heel, the only vulnerable part of his body, the spot his mother had held when she dipped him in the Styx. Some say the arrow was poisoned. Others claim that Apollo himself guided it, or even transformed himself into Paris for the shot. But however it happened, the wound was mortal. This detail about Achilles' heel, his single point of vulnerability, comes from traditions that developed after Homer's time. The earliest accounts, including the Iliad itself, show Achilles being wounded in battle without any mention of complete invulnerability. The image of the infant dipped in the Styx appears in later poets' works. Whether Achilles had this mythical weak point or was simply struck by a well-aimed, God-guided arrow, the outcome remained the same. Achilles, who had been like a god on the battlefield, who had seemed invincible, fell. He tried to pull the arrow out, tried to keep fighting, but the poison or the divine curse worked quickly through his veins. He collapsed before the gates of Troy, the same gates where he had killed Hector, and the Greeks rushed to retrieve his body before the Trojans could take it. Ajax, huge and powerful, lifted Achilles' corpse onto his shoulders and carried it back to camp, while Odysseus held off the pursuing Trojans. The Greeks burned Achilles with all honor, building a pyre fit for the greatest warrior who had ever lived. They placed his ashes in a golden urn, together with the ashes of Patroclus, uniting the friends in death as they had been in life. They held funeral games, competitions in athletics and combat, honoring his memory. And then came the question of his armor, that divine armor Hephaestus had forged, that incredible shield depicting the world. Who would inherit it? Who was worthy? Ajax the Great believed it should be his. He was the second best warrior after Achilles, the man who had carried Achilles' body from the field. But Odysseus also claimed it, arguing that his cunning and intelligence had contributed more to the war effort than mere strength. A vote was held, and Odysseus won. Ajax, humiliated and enraged, went mad. In his madness, he slaughtered sheep believing them to be his enemies, and when sanity returned and he saw what he had done, the shame was too much. He fell on his sword, dying by his own hand, and the Greeks lost another of their greatest heroes. Paris himself did not long survive Achilles. Philoctetes, a Greek hero who possessed the bow and poisoned arrows of Heracles, had been abandoned on the island of Lemnos years before due to a festering snakebite wound that would not heal and produced an unbearable stench. But a prophecy, spoken by the Trojan seer Helenus, who had been captured by the Greeks, declared that Troy could not fall without two things, the bow of Heracles and the bones of Pelops. Odysseus and others sailed to retrieve Philoctetes. They found him bitter, injured, filled with righteous anger at being abandoned and left to suffer for years while his companions fought at Troy. The negotiations were difficult, requiring all of Odysseus's diplomatic skills, but they convinced him to return. His wound was healed by Machaon or Podalirius, the sons of Asclepius, who served as physicians to the Greek army, and Philoctetes, whole once more, joined the war. Philoctetes' arrows, tipped with the venom of the Lernaean hydra that Heracles had slain decades before, were deadly beyond measure. The poison caused unbearable agony, killing slowly and painfully. One such arrow found Paris as he fought on the battlefield or stood on Troy's walls, piercing him with venom that no antidote could cure, piercing him with venom that caused excruciating agony. Paris lingered for days, the poison slowly killing him, and he was taken to his first wife, Wenone, a nymph who had the gift of healing. But Oenone, whom Paris had abandoned for Helen, refused to heal him, bitter at the betrayal. Paris died in agony, and Troy lost the man whose choice on Mount Ida had started everything. The war dragged into its 10th year. Both sides were exhausted, depleted, desperate for some kind of resolution. The Trojans were besieged and starving. The Greeks were far from home, their supplies running low, their patience wearing thin. Something had to break the stalemate. And it was Odysseus, always clever, always thinking, who conceived the plan that would finally bring Troy to its knees. The idea came to him in a dream, or so he claimed later, or perhaps he reasoned it out through logic and understanding of human nature. But the plan was brilliant in its simplicity and its audacity. The Greeks would build an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to hide their best warriors within. They would pretend to give up the siege, burning their camps and sailing away, leaving the horse as a supposed offering to Athena, a prayer for safe passage home. But hidden inside would be a select group of warriors, the best of the Greeks, men who could fight in tight spaces and maintain absolute silence. When the Trojans brought the horse inside the city walls as a trophy and a religious offering, when they celebrated their apparent victory and lowered their guard, the Greeks would emerge in the dead of night, open the gates, and let in the rest of the army, which would not have sailed away at all, but merely hidden nearby, waiting for the signal. It was dangerous. It was deceptive. It violated the normal rules of warfare. But it might work. The plan was approved. Epeius, a skilled craftsman and warrior, designed and oversaw the construction. They built the horse from pine and ash, making it so large it loomed like a small building, assembling it piece by piece, creating the hollow interior where men could hide, carefully concealing the trapdoor in its belly. On its side, they carved an inscription in Greek. For their return home, the Greeks dedicate this offering to Athena. Selecting who would go inside was crucial. They needed the best fighters, men who could keep silent even in discomfort and fear, men who would not panic in the cramped darkness. Odysseus himself would lead them. Menelaus, still driven by his desire to reclaim Helen, volunteered immediately. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, young but eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, insisted on going. Diomedes, Philoctetes, and others joined. The ancient sources disagree on the exact number, with some Byzantine scholars suggesting 23 men, while other traditions claim as many as 50 or more warriors crammed into the horse's belly. Most later retellings settle on around 30 to 40 as a workable number for such a space. One Greek was chosen for an especially dangerous role. Sinon, a cousin of Odysseus, would stay behind when the fleet sailed away, presenting himself as a deserter, a man left behind by the fleeing Greeks. He would spin a tale to the Trojans, convincing them to take the horse inside the city. His acting had to be perfect. If the Trojans suspected deception, they would burn the horse, and everyone inside would die. The rest of the Greeks burned their camps, creating the appearance of total departure. They boarded their ships and sailed, but only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, where they dropped anchor out of sight of Troy's watchtowers. They would wait there, watching for the signal, ready to sail back at a moment's notice. From the walls of Troy, the Trojans watched the smoke rise from the burning Greek camp and could hardly believe what they were seeing. After 10 years, the Greeks were leaving. The siege was over. They had won. The gates opened for the first time in a decade, and Trojans poured out onto the plain, laughing, crying, dancing in the abandoned Greek camp, marveling at the destruction, the debris, the evidence that their enemies were truly gone. And there, standing alone on the beach, was the horse. Massive, magnificent, mysterious. The Trojans gathered around it, debating what to do. Some wanted to burn it immediately. Others suggested rolling it off a cliff. Still others argued for keeping it, bringing it into the city as a trophy, proof of Troy's endurance and eventual victory. Sinon, captured by Trojan scouts, played his role perfectly. He claimed the Greeks had wanted to sacrifice him for favorable winds, just as they had sacrificed Iphigenia 10 years before. He had escaped, he said, and the Greeks had left him behind. He was bitter, angry at his former comrades, eager to help Troy in any way he could. And the horse? It was an offering to Athena, he explained, built large specifically so the Trojans could not bring it inside their city, because if they did, the goddess would favor Troy instead of Greece. The Trojan priest Laocoon did not believe the story. He warned his people with words that would become famous. "I fear Greeks even when they bring gifts." He threw a spear at the horse's side, and the Greeks inside held their breath, certain they had been discovered. But at that moment, 2 enormous serpents emerged from the sea and attacked Laocoon and his 2 sons, crushing them to death in their coils. Different traditions gave different explanations for this event. In the version told by Virgil's Aeneid, the serpents were sent by gods who favored the Greeks, specifically to silence Laocoon's warning. An older tradition suggested Apollo sent them to punish Laocoon for an entirely different transgression, an act of sacrilege unrelated to the horse. But to the Trojans watching in horror, the meaning seemed clear. Laocoon had been punished by the gods for disrespecting the offering to Athena. The horse, they concluded, must be sacred. They must bring it into the city. Some suggested that they had to partially dismantle a section of their wall to make an opening large enough, which they did, breaking the walls that had protected them for 10 years. Others say they brought it through the gates, which had to be widened. Either way, the Trojans brought the horse inside Troy. They celebrated that night with wine and song, relief and joy flooding through the city. The war was over. They had endured. Troy had survived. The parties went late into the night, and eventually, exhausted by celebration and drink, the Trojans slept. One story, told in the Odyssey, adds a haunting detail to this night. Helen, according to this account, came to the horse and walked around it, calling out to the hidden Greeks in voices that mimicked their wives, testing whether anyone would respond and reveal themselves. Anticlus nearly answered, recognizing what he thought was his wife's voice. But Odysseus clamped a hand over his mouth, maintaining the silence that kept them all alive. Whether this story is true, whether Helen was trying to expose the Greeks, or merely suspected something, or whether she was entirely innocent of any suspicion that night, the ancient sources themselves offer no consensus. Inside the horse, the Greeks waited in absolute silence, cramped and sweating, listening to the sounds of celebration outside. They waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the drunkest revelers had finally collapsed, into sleep, when the city was quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or cry of an infant. Then Sinon, free to roam the city as a supposed ally, lit a signal torch visible to the ships hiding at Tenedos, and Odysseus, inside the horse, carefully, quietly, opened the trapdoor. One by one, the Greeks climbed down, emerging into the dark streets of Troy, drawing their weapons, moving like shadows toward the gates. They killed the few guards who had remained at their posts, men too drunk or too tired to react quickly. They unbarred the massive gates and threw them open. And there, flowing through the gates like a dark tide, came the rest of the Greek army, returned from Tenedos, armed and ready and hungry for vengeance. What followed was not battle, it was slaughter. The Trojans, waking to find Greek warriors in their homes, in their streets, at their throats, barely had time to understand what was happening before they died. The Greeks, after 10 years of frustration, showed no mercy. They killed every man they found. They set fires that spread quickly through the wooden buildings. They searched every house for plunder and for women. King Priam, old and unarmed, was dragged to an altar and butchered there, killed by Neoptolemus in a final act of cruelty. Hector's infant son Astyanax was torn from his mother Andromache's arms and thrown from the walls. The Greeks, fearing that any son of Hector might grow up to seek revenge. Women who had been queens and princesses were claimed as slaves, distributed among the Greek heroes like any other spoil of war. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, who had been cursed by Apollo to speak prophecies that no one would believe, met a tragic end during the sack. According to most accounts, Ajax the Lesser dragged her from Athena's temple, where she had taken refuge, and violated her there, a sacrilege that would later result in the goddess's vengeance against him. For this crime against both Cassandra and the goddess whose temple he had defiled, Athena would drown Ajax at sea during the journey home. Cassandra herself was claimed by Agamemnon as a concubine and would die alongside him when they reached Mycenae. Hecuba, who had been queen of the mightiest city in Asia, was enslaved by Odysseus, forced to watch everything she loved destroyed before her eyes. The city burned through the night. The flames could be seen for miles, a funeral pyre for Troy, for a civilization, for an entire way of life. By morning, nothing remained but smoldering ruins, corpses in the streets, and Greek warriors picking through the rubble for treasure. Troy, which had stood for generations, which had never been conquered, which had defied the greatest army Greece could assemble for 10 long years, fell in a single night, brought down not by strength, but by deception, by a wooden horse, and the cunning of Odysseus. The fates of the survivors. The fall of Troy brought no clean victory, no happy ending for anyone. The Greeks had won, but the gods were not pleased with how the victory had been achieved. The violence, the sacrilege, the desecration of temples and violation of sacred spaces, all of this angered the gods. The Greeks would pay for their crimes, not on the battlefield, but on the long, cursed journey home. Menelaus, the man who had started all this, who had called the armies to Troy to retrieve his stolen wife, finally found Helen. She had been living in the palace, first with Paris, then after his death with his brother Deiphobus, whom the Greeks killed when the city fell. Different sources tell different versions of their reunion. In some accounts, Menelaus intended to kill her. He drew his sword, approached her with murder in his heart, determined to punish the woman whose beauty had caused 10 years of war and the deaths of thousands. But when Helen stood before him, when he looked into her face, when she tore her clothing and revealed herself to him, his resolve crumbled. He could not do it. The love or lust or obsession that had defined his life remained stronger than revenge. He lowered his sword. In another version, Helen had been waiting for the Greeks, knowing they would come, perhaps even helping them by signaling from the walls or opening gates. In this telling, she was less guilty, more victim, a woman who had wanted to return home all along, but had been kept in Troy by circumstances beyond her control. Regardless, Menelaus took Helen back. They returned to the ships, and after a long journey filled with storms and delays, including a detour to Egypt in some versions, they eventually reached Sparta. There they ruled together, apparently reconciled, apparently at peace. Homer's Odyssey depicts them years later as a contented couple, Helen spinning wool in her hall, Menelaus hosting guests, both of them telling stories of the war. Whether Helen was truly happy or simply resigned to her fate, whether Menelaus truly forgave her or simply could not exist without her, the sources do not say. Odysseus, the architect of Troy's fall, faced the longest and most difficult journey home. Poseidon, angry that Odysseus had blinded his son the Cyclops, cursed the hero to wander for 10 years, the same length as the war itself. His journey became its own epic, the Odyssey, filled with monsters and gods, with temptations and trials, with loss and perseverance. He lost all his men. Every single warrior who had survived the war died on the journey home. By the time Odysseus reached Ithaca, he was alone, disguised as a beggar, forced to reclaim his palace from suitors who had besieged his wife Penelope. But he survived. He reunited with his family, and he found the peace that so many others did not. Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces, victor of Troy, expected to return home in triumph. He brought with him Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess, claimed as his concubine, along with vast treasures plundered from Troy's ruins. He arrived at Mycenae thinking of celebration and rest, after 10 years of war. He did not know that his wife Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia, had taken a lover in his absence. Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus waited for Agamemnon's return with murder in their hearts. When the king entered his palace, tired from travel, eager for a bath and comfort, Clytemnestra greeted him with false warmth. She prepared a bath for him, and when he was naked and vulnerable, she threw a net or heavy cloth over him, entangling him. Then either she or Aegisthus, the sources differ, struck him down with an axe or sword, killing him in his own bathroom. Cassandra, who had prophesied this very event, but as always went unbelieved, was murdered alongside him. Clytemnestra's justification was Iphigenia's death. She had sacrificed their daughter for wind and glory, and now she had paid the price. But vengeance breeds vengeance, and years later, Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's son Orestes would return to murder his own mother, avenging his father, setting off a new cycle of blood feuds that would require divine intervention to resolve. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, claimed Andromache, Hector's widow, as his prize. He brought her back to Greece where she bore him children, living in slavery to the son of the man who had killed her husband. Neoptolemus himself was later killed at Delphi, murdered at Apollo's temple in unclear circumstances, perhaps killed by rivals, perhaps struck down by the god himself for his father's acts of sacrilege. Ajax the Lesser, who had violated Cassandra in Athena's temple, never made it home. Athena struck his ship with lightning, shattering it in the middle of the sea. Ajax managed to reach a rock, clinging to it as waves crashed over him. He boasted that he had survived despite the god's anger, and for that hubris, Poseidon split the rock with his trident, and Ajax drowned. Diomedes returned to Argos to find his wife had been unfaithful, turned against him by Aphrodite's curse. He was forced to flee his own city, eventually sailing to Italy, where he founded new settlements, never to see his homeland again. Of the thousands who had sailed to Troy, only a few hundred made it home, and many of those found their homes changed, their families dead or scattered, their kingdoms diminished. The cost of the war had been almost beyond reckoning. And what of Troy itself? The city burned, its walls broken, its palaces collapsed into rubble, but not everyone perished. Aeneas, a Trojan prince from the royal bloodline, had fought bravely throughout the war. When the city fell, guided by the gods, he managed to escape, carrying his elderly father Anchises on his back, leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, gathering survivors who looked to him for leadership. Aeneas's journey would become another legend, told in Virgil's Aeneid, written centuries later to glorify Rome's origins. He wandered the Mediterranean, facing many of the same challenges Odysseus did, driven by prophecy toward a new home, a new destiny. Eventually, his descendants would found Rome, and the Trojan blood would flow in Roman veins. The empire that conquered Greece descended from the people Greece had destroyed. But that was centuries in the future. For now, Troy was ashes and memory. The war was over, and all that remained was the long counting of the cost. Reflections on War and Destiny. The story of the Trojan War, as told and retold over 3,000 years, is not really about who was right or wrong, Greek or Trojan, victory or defeat. It is about the terrible momentum of violence, about how small choices cascade into enormous consequences, about how pride and honor and love and hate can bind themselves together until they become impossible to separate. It began with a wedding, with gods celebrating, with a slight to one goddess who brought a golden apple to a feast. That apple, that moment of vanity and competition, led to a young prince making a choice on a mountain, led to the abduction or elopement of a beautiful woman, led to oaths being called in and armies gathering, led to 10 years of death and destruction. No one involved could have predicted how it would end. Paris thought he was choosing love. Helen thought she was following her heart or being swept away by divine power. Menelaus thought he was defending his honor. Agamemnon thought he was building an empire. Achilles thought he was earning glory. All of them were right, and all of them were wrong. The Trojan War became the defining myth of ancient Greece because it captured something essential about human nature and the gods who shaped it. It showed heroes at their best and their worst, noble and petty, courageous and cruel. It showed how even the gods could be petty, could play favorites, could let their own feuds and desires shape the fates of mortals. And it showed that victory itself could be a kind of defeat. The Greeks won, but what did they win? Ashes and slaves and treasure that could not bring back the dead. They won a war that left them so depleted that their own civilization would soon enter a dark age, that the great palaces of Mycenaean Greece would themselves fall, that the age of heroes would end not in glory, but in collapse. The story of Achilles choosing glory over long life became an archetype for a reason. He knew his fate, knew that if he went to Troy, he would die young, but he went anyway because he believed that a short life filled with meaning was worth more than a long life filled with nothing. And yet, when he speaks to Odysseus from the underworld in the Odyssey, he says he would rather be a slave living under the sun than a king among the dead. Even Achilles, in the end, regretted his choice. The Trojan War has been retold in every generation because each generation sees something different in it, something that speaks to their own time. The ancient Greeks saw it as history, as the story of their ancestors, as proof of their greatness, and a warning about their flaws. Medieval Europeans saw it as romance, as courtly love and knightly combat. Modern readers see it as tragedy, as futility, as a warning about the cost of war and the danger of letting honor override humanity. But at its core, it remains a story about people, about choices, about love and hate and pride and grief. It remains a story about how even gods could not prevent suffering, could not make the characters do the sensible thing, could not stop the momentum once it began. It remains a story about how beauty can be dangerous, how glory can be hollow, how victory can taste like ashes. Helen lived to old age in Sparta, according to most accounts, dwelling there with Menelaus in what Homer's Odyssey portrays as a reconciled, if perhaps not entirely happy, marriage. Later traditions offered alternative fates. Some said she was made immortal and taken to the Elysian fields, or married to Achilles in the afterlife. Others claimed she was driven from Sparta after Menelaus's death and hanged by vengeful women. The variety of her possible endings perhaps reflects how each generation struggled to decide what justice looked like for a woman whose beauty had caused such destruction. But whatever her fate, she would have lived with the knowledge that thousands had died in a war fought over her, that a great city had fallen, that her face had indeed launched 1,000 ships straight into horror and flame. The ruins of Troy, excavated by archaeologists, show layer upon layer of destruction, cities built and burned and rebuilt on the same spot over centuries. We may never know if the Trojan War, as Homer told it, actually happened, if there was a real Helen, a real Achilles, a real 10-year siege. But we know that Troy burned, repeatedly, that wars were fought there, that the story resonated so deeply that it survived the collapse of civilizations and the passage of millennia. And perhaps that is the real power of the story. Not whether it is historically true, but that it is emotionally true, that it captures something about human nature that remains relevant no matter how much time passes. We still fight wars over honor and pride. We still make choices in the heat of passion that we regret later. We still struggle with the conflict between duty and desire, between what we know is wise and what our hearts demand. The Trojan War, which began with a wedding and ended with a burning city, which stretched across 10 years and touched the lives of gods and mortals, heroes and cowards, warriors and victims, remains one of humanity's greatest stories, because it is, at its core, a mirror. And when we look into that mirror, we see ourselves, in all our glory and all our flaws, in all our capacity for both greatness and terrible mistakes. The war is over. Troy has fallen. But the story continues, retold, reimagined, reinterpreted, each generation finding new meaning in these ancient words. And as long as humans tell stories, as long as we struggle with love and war and fate and choice, the tale of Troy will never truly end. Thank you so much for joining me on this epic journey through one of mythology's greatest tales. Now on to the Odyssey. Tonight we are telling one story from beginning to end, the longest journey home that has ever been sung. This is the tale of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and the 10 impossible years it took him to sail from the smoking ruins of Troy back to the wife, the son, and the small rocky island he loved more than any god's paradise. Troy had fallen. After 10 long years of siege, of grief, of heroes rising and heroes dying beneath its walls, the city of Priam was ash and rubble, and the war that had consumed a generation of Greek manhood was finally over. The wooden horse had done what 10 years of spears could not. Odysseus, the cunning king of a small and stony island called Ithaca, had built the plan. And it had worked exactly as he hoped. Troy burned. Its king was dead. Its women were divided among the victors like spoils of grain and gold. And the Greek fleet, that vast gathering of ships that had once darkened the shore at Odyssey, began to break apart and scatter toward home. You would think, after 10 years apart from wives and sons and the smell of their own hearths, that the journey back would be short. Simple. A matter of wind and sail and a few weeks at sea. For most of the Greek commanders, more or less, it was. Nestor sailed home to Pylos without much trouble. Even Menelaus, after some wandering, eventually returned to Sparta with Helen at his side, the woman whose face had launched the whole terrible war. Agamemnon, the High King, sailed home too, straight into a murder that had been waiting for him for 10 years. But that is a different story, one of blood and betrayal inside his own halls, and we will touch it only where it brushes against our tale tonight. But Odysseus, the man whose intelligence had won the war for Greece, would not see his home again for 10 more years. 10 years of war, and then 10 years of wandering, until 2 full decades had been carved out of one man's life, and out of the life of the wife who waited for him, and the son who grew from an infant into a man in his absence. Why? Why should the cleverest of all the Greeks be punished with the longest road home, when lesser men sailed home in weeks? The answer begins, as so many disasters in Greek myth do, with a god's wounded pride, and it begins specifically with the sea itself. Because somewhere between the burning towers of Troy and the safety of open water, Odysseus made an enemy of Poseidon, lord of the seas, shaker of the earth, a god whose reach stretched across every wave that Odysseus would ever need to cross. And a man who angers the god of the sea and then tries to sail home is a man who has picked the worst possible enemy at the worst possible moment. This is the story of how that happened, and everything that followed. It is a story of monsters and witches, of the land of the dead and the song of the sirens, of a nymph's island where time seemed to stop, and of a wife back home who wove and unwove a burial shroud for 3 long years rather than give up hope. It is the story of a son who grew from a boy too frightened to speak in his own hall into a young man capable of standing beside his father with a sword in his hand. And it is, more than anything, a story about what it means to long for home so badly that you will suffer anything, endure anything, outlast gods and monsters alike, just to see the smoke rising from your own chimney one more time. The Greeks had a word for this longing. They called it nostos, the journey home, the ache of it, the near impossibility of it. From that word, we get our modern word nostalgia, the pain of homecoming, or the pain of its absence. No story in all of Greek mythology captures that ache more completely than the tale of Odysseus, a man so associated with wandering and cleverness that his name became a word in its own right. Even now, when we say a journey has become an Odyssey, we are borrowing the memory of this exact king, this exact voyage, and this exact impossible distance between a man and his home. So let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the war, which had already ended, but the beginning of the voyage, when Odysseus and his 12 ships pulled away from the smoking ruin of Troy, their holds full of plunder, their hearts full of relief, believing, as every soldier believes when a war finally ends, that the worst was already behind them. They could not have been more wrong. The raid on the Sacones, the first stop on the journey home, was not chosen by fate or by any god's grudge. It was chosen by Odysseus himself, and it would set the tone for everything that followed. A small but telling reminder that even a hero as clever as Odysseus was still a man of his age, a soldier shaped by 10 years of war and not always able to resist the temptation of easy plunder. Sailing north from Troy, the fleet came upon the land of the Sacones, a people allied with the Trojans who lived in a coastal city called Ismarus. Odysseus and his men, still flush with victory and still thinking like raiders rather than travelers, fell upon the city. They sacked it. They took the women. They seized the wine and the livestock and whatever wealth the town possessed. And by any measure of the old world's brutal logic, the raid was a success. But Odysseus, ever the strategist, urged his men to load the ships and sail away immediately, before the Sacones could regroup and call on their neighbors for help. His men, drunk on wine and victory, refused. They wanted to feast on the beach. They wanted to celebrate, to slaughter the captured sheep and cattle, to drink deep into the night as though the war itself had finally, truly ended and the world owed them a party. It was a fatal mistake, though not the last one his men would make. While the Greeks lingered on the shore, gorging themselves, the Sacones who had escaped inland gathered reinforcements from other Sacone tribes further from the coast. Men experienced in fighting from chariots and on foot alike. At dawn, they returned in force, and what had been a one-sided raid became a desperate, bloody battle. Odysseus and his men fought as long as they could, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard, still groggy from the night before. 6 men from each ship were killed before Odysseus finally managed to get the survivors back aboard and pull away from that cursed shore. It was a small defeat in the grand scheme of the war they had just won, but it was the first sign of something larger. The gods, it seemed, were already beginning to take notice of how these victorious Greeks would behave now that Troy no longer disciplined them with the constant threat of death. And Zeus himself, watching from Olympus, is said to have decided in that moment that punishment was due, not just to Odysseus, but to the fleet, for the excesses and cruelties even a justified war can produce. A storm rose up as they sailed on, driving the ships off their intended course, past the safe waters they knew, and into the strange, uncharted seas where the true adventure of the Odyssey would begin. The land of the Lotus Eaters for 9 days, the storm battered Odysseus's ships, driving them far from the routes they knew, far from the safe coastal hops that would have brought them home along familiar waters. When the wind finally quieted, the fleet found itself in unfamiliar territory, off the coast of a strange and gentle seeming land inhabited by a people the Greeks came to call the Lotus Eaters. There was no violence here, no monsters, no ambush, no clash of swords, and in a way, that made the danger even stranger and even more insidious, because the threat of the Lotus Eaters was not a threat of death. It was a threat of forgetting. Odysseus sent 3 of his men ashore to scout the land and learn what kind of people lived there. The Lotus Eaters, as it turned out, were peaceful, and they greeted the Greek scouts with what looked, at first, like ordinary hospitality. They offered the men food, a strange honeyed fruit from the lotus plant that grew abundantly on their shores. The scouts, hungry and grateful, ate. The effect was immediate and total. Whoever tasted the honeyed fruit of the lotus lost, in an instant, any desire to return home. Ambition, memory, longing, love of family, all of it dissolved into a warm, honeyed haze. The men wanted nothing more than to stay among the lotus eaters forever, to eat more of the fruit, to sit in the sun and let the years slide by without care or consequence. When Odysseus, growing anxious at the scouts' failure to return, went ashore himself, he found them among the lotus eaters, docile, smiling, indifferent, men who had forgotten they even had a home to miss. It is worth pausing here, because this episode, small as it is compared to what comes later, carries one of the truest warnings in the whole epic. Odysseus was not fighting monsters yet. He was fighting the temptation to simply stop. To give up the ache of longing in exchange for painless, thoughtless comfort. Every hero's journey eventually meets this fork in the road. The moment where continuing forward is harder than simply lying down and letting the world's sweetness swallow you whole. Odysseus did not give in, and more importantly, he did not let his men give in either. He dragged his intoxicated scouts back to the ships by force, weeping and struggling the entire way, men who had, for a few honeyed hours, tasted a kind of peace more total than anything home could offer, and who resented bitterly being pulled back into the world of longing and effort and pain. Odysseus bound them beneath the rowing benches so they could not leap overboard and swim back to shore, and gave the order to sail on immediately, before any more of his crew could wander into that fatal orchard and lose themselves forever. It was a narrow escape from an enemy that used no weapon at all, only comfort, and it was the perfect prelude to the far more violent test that awaited them just beyond the horizon, on an island inhabited by a race of giant. One-eyed shepherds who answered to no laws of gods or men. The cave of the Cyclops, the island of the Cyclopes, was not far from the land of the Lotus Eaters, and Odysseus, driven by that restless curiosity that defined him as much as his cunning did, could not resist the chance to explore it. He left most of his fleet anchored at a smaller, uninhabited island nearby, a haven thick with wild goats, and took just one ship and a crew of 12 men to investigate the mainland, where columns of smoke rose from what looked like the caves of some unknown people. What Odysseus and his men found was the cave of Polyphemus, a Cyclops, one of a race of giant, one-eyed shepherds who lived apart from all human civilization, wild and lawless, obedient to no code of hospitality, no council of elders, no gods but their own appetite. Polyphemus himself, as it happened, was no ordinary Cyclops even among his own kind. He was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea, born to the sea nymph Ithaca, a detail that seemed almost incidental in the moment and would prove to be the single most consequential fact in the entire story that followed. Odysseus and his 12 men entered the cave while its owner was out tending his flocks, and they found it stocked with cheeses, pails of milk, and pens crowded with lambs and kids. His men urged him to steal what they needed and flee immediately, back to the safety of the ship. Odysseus, driven by curiosity and by a hope of receiving a guest gift from whatever host lived here, in keeping with the sacred Greek tradition of hospitality known as xenia, refused. He wanted to see the owner of the cave. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. Polyphemus returned that evening, driving his flocks before him, and sealed the cave's entrance with an enormous boulder, a stone so massive that no ordinary group of men could ever hope to move it. Only then did he notice his uninvited guests. Odysseus, in the grand tradition of Greek travelers, appealed to the sacred laws of hospitality and asked for the kindness owed to any traveler under the protection of Zeus. Polyphemus's answer was to seize 2 of Odysseus's men, dash them against the cave floor, and devour them raw for his evening meal. The night that followed was a nightmare of helplessness. Trapped behind that immovable boulder, Odysseus and his surviving men could only watch as Polyphemus slept off his grisly meal, unable to strike back without also condemning themselves, since only the Cyclops himself had the strength to move the stone that sealed them inside. In the morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more men for breakfast before driving his flocks out to pasture, sealing the cave again behind him and trapping the Greeks for another full day of dread. It was during that long, terrible waiting period that Odysseus devised his plan, and it remains one of the most celebrated examples of cunning, of what the Greeks called metes, in the entire body of Greek mythology. He and his remaining men found a great staff of olive wood in the cave, as tall and thick as a ship's mast, and they sharpened one end to a point and hardened it in the fire. When Polyphemus returned that evening and devoured 2 more of the crew, Odysseus offered him a skin of extraordinarily strong, undiluted wine, a gift he had been carrying since before they landed. Polyphemus, delighted, drank cup after cup and asked Odysseus his name, promising a guest gift in return. Odysseus answered with the single cleverest lie in all of Greek literature. He told the Cyclops his name was Nobody. Polyphemus, now thoroughly drunk, collapsed into a heavy sleep. Odysseus and his remaining men heated the sharpened staff in the coals of the fire until it glowed, and together they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye, twisting it as one might twist a drill boring through wood. Polyphemus howled in agony, a scream so enormous it brought the other Cyclopes running from their own caves scattered across the hillside, calling out to ask what was wrong, whether someone was attacking him. Polyphemus's answer, muffled by pain and fury, was that nobody was attacking him. Nobody was killing him. His fellow Cyclopes, hearing this, assumed he must be raving or suffering some divine affliction, since if nobody was harming him, there was nothing they could do, and they returned to their own caves, leaving Polyphemus alone with his tormentors and his blindness. The next morning, blind and desperate to catch the men who had maimed him, Polyphemus rolled the boulder away from the cave's mouth, just enough to let his flock of sheep pass through to pasture, feeling along their backs with his hands to make sure no man was riding out on top of them in escape. But Odysseus had anticipated this too. He had his remaining men bind themselves beneath the bellies of the largest rams, 3 animals lashed together for each man, clinging to the wall from underneath where Polyphemus's groping hands could not detect them. Odysseus himself rode out clinging to the belly of the largest, finest ram in the flock, the Cyclops' own favourite, and Polyphemus, feeling only the familiar wool along the animal's back, let it pass without suspicion, murmuring sadly to the ram about how it grieved to see its master blinded. Once outside, Odysseus and his surviving crew, roughly half the men who had entered the cave, released the sheep, ran for their ship, and rowed hard for open water. And it was here, at the very edge of safety, that Odysseus made the single most fateful decision of the entire voyage. He could not resist calling back to the blind giant, taunting him from the safety of his ship, announcing his true name and his home, boasting that it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, king of Ithaca, who had blinded him, not nobody at all. His men begged him to stay silent. This one act of pride, of wanting the credit for his own cleverness, rather than letting the anonymous trick stand as its own reward, would cost them everything that followed. Polyphemus, hearing the name at last, remembered an old prophecy once given to him by a seer named Telemus, who had foretold that a man named Odysseus would one day take his sight. Blind and furious, the Cyclops tore a mountaintop from the hillside and hurled it toward the sound of Odysseus's voice, so close it nearly crushed the ship and sent a wave surging beneath it that drove them dangerously close back to shore. And then, in his rage and grief, Polyphemus lifted his hands to the sky and called upon his father, the god Poseidon, earth-shaker, lord of the sea, and prayed the darkest prayer in the entire poem. He asked that Odysseus never reach his home, and if he was fated to reach it, Polyphemus prayed, then let him arrive late, and in misery, having lost all his companions, arriving in a stranger's ship, only to find trouble waiting for him in his own house. Poseidon heard that prayer, and Poseidon, unlike so many of the fickle, half-attentive gods of Olympus, did not forget it. From that moment on, every wave Odysseus sailed, every storm that rose against him, every year added to his 10-year voyage, carried the weight of a father's fury on behalf of his wounded son. It is worth understanding clearly what this curse meant, because it explains everything that follows in this story. Odysseus was not simply unlucky. He was not merely a man beset by a string of misfortunes. He had been marked, specifically and personally, by one of the most powerful gods in the entire Greek pantheon, a god whose domain, the sea, was the very road Odysseus needed to travel to reach home. Every single stretch of open water between Troy and Ithaca now belonged, in a sense, to his enemy. Odysseus escaped the island of the Cyclopes with his life and 11 of his 12 ships still afloat, but he had also, through one moment of pride, guaranteed that the 10 years still ahead of him would be the hardest of his entire life. Aeolus and the bag of winds from the island of the Cyclopes, battered but still afloat, Odysseus and his remaining ships sailed on until they reached the floating island of Aeolia, home to Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus was no ordinary king. The gods had granted him dominion over the winds of the world, the power to calm a raging sea or summon a storm at will, and he lived in a bronze-walled palace with his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, married to one another in pairs, feasting endlessly in a kind of strange, self-contained paradise entirely removed from the struggles of ordinary mortals. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his men with the warmth of true hospitality, feeding them for an entire month while he listened, fascinated, to the tale of the fall of Troy. When at last Odysseus asked for help continuing his voyage home, Aeolus gave him an extraordinary gift. He captured all the world's contrary winds, the north wind, the south wind, the fierce and scattering east wind, every gust and gale that might blow a ship off its course, and bound them tightly inside a great sack made of ox hide, sealed with a silver cord so that not a breath of wind could escape. He left free only the gentle west wind, whose steady breath would carry Odysseus's ships directly home to Ithaca. For 9 days and 9 nights, the plan worked perfectly. The west wind filled their sails, and the ships glided smoothly across the sea, so smoothly and so swiftly that by the 10th day, Ithaca itself came into view. Odysseus could see the fires burning on his own shores, could make out the shapes of men tending them. Home, after 10 years of war and nearly 2 more weeks of harrowing adventure, was finally, achingly close. And it was at that exact moment, exhausted from personally holding the ship's rudder for 9 sleepless days and nights, unwilling to trust the task to anyone else so close to the finish line, that Odysseus finally allowed himself to fall asleep. His men, watching him rest, began to whisper among themselves. They had noticed the mysterious sack Aeolus had given their captain, the one Odysseus had kept close and refused to explain. In their exhaustion and their suspicion, they convinced themselves it must contain treasure, gold and silver that Odysseus intended to keep entirely for himself, while they, who had fought and bled and rowed just as hard as he had, would return home with nothing extra to show for 10 years of war and hardship. Overcome by greed and resentment, they untied the silver cord while their captain slept. All the imprisoned winds burst free at once, a howling, catastrophic gale that swept the ships backward across the very distance it had taken them 9 days to cross, hurling them, in a matter of hours, all the way back to the shores of Aeolia. Odysseus woke to disaster, his home swallowed once more by the horizon, his men terrified and ashamed at what their greed had cost them. He returned to Aeolus's palace and begged for help a second time. But Aeolus's response was cold and final. He refused outright, declaring that a man so thoroughly hated by the gods, a man cursed so severely that even a gift as precious as controlled winds could be undone by his own crew, must be an enemy of Olympus that Aeolus dared not assist any further. He ordered Odysseus from his island immediately, and this time there would be no farewell feast, no month of hospitality. Only the cold reality that Odysseus and his men would have to row, oar by aching oar, with no wind at their backs at all, uncertain of where the currents might carry them next. The Laestrygonians, what followed was 6 days and 6 nights of pure, exhausting labour, the crews rowing without rest, without the mercy of a single favourable gust, their spirits as broken as their bodies were tired. On the 7th day, they arrived at Telepolis, a natural harbour ringed by towering cliffs, a haven so calm and so sheltered that the sea inside barely rippled even as storms might rage beyond its walls. It seemed, after everything, like a gift. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships sailed directly into that tempting harbour and moored themselves along the shore. Odysseus alone, wary now in a way he had not been wary before the disaster at Aeolia, kept his own ship anchored just outside the harbour's mouth, tied to a rock at the entrance, rather than committing fully to the enclosed bay. It was a decision, born of hard-earned caution, that would save his life and the lives of his immediate crew, even as it could not save the rest of his fleet. He sent 3 scouts ashore to learn what kind of people lived in this new land. They found, not far from the harbour, a young woman drawing water from a spring, who turned out to be the daughter of the local king, a people known as the Laestrygonians. She directed the scouts toward her father's house, and it was there that the true nature of this land revealed itself. The king's wife was a giantess, monstrous in size, and the moment she saw the scouts she summoned her husband, a giant named Antiphates. Without a word of greeting, without any pretense of hospitality, Antiphates seized one of the 3 scouts and devoured him on the spot. The other 2 scouts fled in terror, back toward the harbour, but Antiphates raised the alarm, and Laestrygonians began pouring out from every direction, giants far larger and far more numerous than the single Cyclops Odysseus had barely escaped. They lined the cliffs above the enclosed harbour and began hurling boulders down onto the 11 trapped ships below, smashing hulls, crushing men, turning the calm and beautiful bay into a slaughterhouse of splintered wood and drowning sailors. Those Laestrygonians, who could reach the wreckage, waded into the water and speared the swimming, struggling Greeks like men spearing fish, gathering the bodies for their own grim feast. Odysseus, watching this massacre unfold from his ship anchored outside the harbour's mouth, understood in an instant that there was no rescue to be attempted, no way to save the 11 ships already trapped within the giant's reach. He drew his sword, cut the mooring rope that held his own ship to the rock, and ordered his men to row for open water with everything they had left in their arms. It was the only ship and the only crew out of a fleet that had once numbered 12 vessels and hundreds of men. To escape the harbour of the Laestrygonians alive. In the span of a single afternoon, Odysseus had lost the overwhelming majority of his fleet and his men, not to any grand battle, not to the wrath of a major god, but to giants who saw shipwrecked sailors as nothing more than food. He sailed on now with a single ship, and a crew reduced to a fraction of what had set out from Troy, carrying with him not only the physical wounds of the disaster, but the crushing weight of command, the knowledge that every decision from this point forward carried the survival of the last of his men in the balance. Circe and the Isle of Aeaea grieving, exhausted and reduced to one lone vessel, Odysseus and his surviving crew came at last to the island of Aeaea, home of the sorceress Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios. It was here that the character of the voyage began to shift, moving away from pure physical danger, giants and cannibals and boulders hurled from cliffs, and into something stranger, more psychological. A landscape where the true danger lay not in brute force, but in enchantment, seduction, and the loss of one's own human shape and mind. For 2 days and 2 nights, the exhausted men rested on the beach, too grief-stricken and too worn down by loss to explore. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed a height of land and spotted smoke rising from a structure deep within the island's forest, a sign of habitation. Uncertain whether they would find friend or enemy, he divided his remaining men into 2 groups, one to stay with the ship, one to investigate, and had them draw lots to decide which group would take the risk of exploring first. The lot fell to a company led by a man named Eurylochus, 22 men in total, who set off into the woods toward the smoke. They came upon a magnificent palace built of polished stone, surrounded, strangely, by mountain wolves and lions that showed no aggression at all, but instead approached the men with a docile, almost pleading gentleness, wagging like dogs greeting their masters. These animals, though the men did not yet realize it, had once been men themselves, travelers who had wandered onto Circe's island before them and fallen under her spell. From within the palace came the sound of a woman singing, a voice so beautiful that the men called out to her. And Circe herself emerged and invited them inside with every appearance of warm hospitality. All of Eurylochus's men accepted, drawn by the promise of food and rest after so much suffering. Eurylochus alone, suspicious by nature and wiser for it, remained hidden outside and watched. Inside, Circe prepared a meal for the starving men, a rich stew of cheese, barley, honey, and wine, laced secretly with a powerful drug. The moment the men finished eating, Circe struck each of them with her wand, and one by one they transformed into pigs, their bodies shrinking, bristles sprouting across their skin, their voices reduced to helpless squealing, though, in the cruelest twist of the enchantment, their minds remained entirely human, aware and horrified at what they had become. Trapped now in a pigsty driven there by the very woman who had smiled and fed them only moments before. Eurylochus, watching this transformation from his hiding place outside, fled back to the ship in terror and reported what he had seen to Odysseus. Without hesitation, and against Eurylochus's desperate pleading to simply flee the island and abandon the transformed men to their fate, Odysseus set off alone through the forest to confront the sorceress and rescue his crew. It was on that lonely path through Circe's woods that the god Hermes, messenger of Olympus, appeared to Odysseus in the guise of a young man sent by the gods to intervene on the hero's behalf, an early and crucial sign that not every divine power in this story stood against him, whatever grudge Poseidon might hold. Hermes warned Odysseus of exactly what awaited him, and gave him a plant called moly, a herb with a black root and a white flower, said to be too dangerous for ordinary mortals to safely uproot, which would protect him from Circe's transformative magic. Hermes instructed him precisely in what to do. Eat the herb before entering the palace. Accept Circe's food and drink without fear, since the moly would neutralize its power. And when Circe struck him with her wand, expecting him to transform like all the rest, he was to draw his sword and rush at her, as though to kill her, which would force her to recognize a man protected by the will of the gods and beg for mercy. Everything unfolded exactly as Hermes had described. Odysseus ate the herb, entered the palace, accepted Circe's poisoned feast without harm. And when she struck him with her wand, and he did not transform, Circe understood at once who stood before her. She had heard, she said, of a man destined to resist her power, a dark-haired traveller that Hermes himself had once warned her would come. Terrified now, and recognizing that she faced no ordinary wanderer, Circe begged for mercy and invited Odysseus into her bed as a gesture of reconciliation and peace, a common enough motif in these old tales, where conflict between mortal and immortal so often resolves itself through an offer of intimacy. Odysseus, wary of yet another trap, made Circe swear a solemn and binding oath before accepting, an oath that she would do him no further harm and would restore his men to their true human forms. Circe swore and kept her word. She anointed each transformed pig with a magical ointment, and one by one the bristles fell away, the snouts shortened back into human faces, and Odysseus's men stood before him once more, taller and younger and more handsome than they had even been before the transformation, weeping with relief and gratitude at their restoration. What followed was not immediate departure, but an entire year of rest, feasting, and healing on Circe's island, a full year during which grief-worn, battle-scarred men who had endured shipwreck, cannibal giants, and enchantment slowly regained their strength, their spirits, and something like ordinary human contentment. Odysseus himself became Circe's companion during this long respite, and by many later accounts, this island interlude produced children who would go on to shape their own legends in the stories that came after. But comfort, however genuine, was never Odysseus's true destination. And it was his men, at the year's end, who finally reminded their captain that Ithaca still waited, and that no matter how kind their host had become, this was still not home. Circe, when Odysseus finally asked her help in continuing the voyage, gave him news that must have chilled him to the bone. Before he could return to Ithaca, she told him, he must first undertake a journey no living man was meant to make. He would have to sail to the edge of the world, to the land of the Cimmerians where the sun never shines, and descend into the realm of the dead itself, to consult the shade of a blind Theban prophet named Tiresias, the only soul in the underworld who retained the gift of true prophecy even in death. Only Tiresias, Circe said, could tell Odysseus the way home and warn him of the dangers that still lay ahead. The journey to the underworld no living man was meant to walk among the dead and return, and yet that is precisely what Odysseus was told he must do. Following Circe's precise instructions, he and his crew sailed to the very edge of the known world, to the land of the Cimmerians. A place shrouded in permanent mist and darkness, where the sun's rays never reached the ground, a fitting threshold for the entrance to the underworld itself. There, exactly as Circe had instructed him, Odysseus dug a trench in the earth and poured libations to the dead, first honeyed milk, then sweet wine, then water, and finally sprinkled barley over the offering. He then sacrificed a ram and a black ewe, letting their dark blood pour into the trench, the scent and substance of it acting as a lure to draw the spirits of the dead up from the depths of Hades to where he stood, sword drawn, holding back the eager throng of shades until the one soul he needed had a chance to speak. The first spirit to approach was not the prophet he sought, but a member of his own crew, a young man named Elpenor, who had died only days earlier on Circe's island in the most undignified way imaginable, falling asleep drunk on the palace roof and tumbling to his death when he woke disoriented and stepped off the edge in the dark. In the rush to depart for this underworld journey, his body had been left behind unburied, without the funeral rites so sacred to Greek custom, and his shade begged Odysseus, with real anguish, to return to Circe's island afterward and give his body a proper burial, so that his soul would not wander the shores of the underworld forever, unable to find rest among the dead. Odysseus promised he would, a promise he would in fact keep on his way back from this grim errand. Next came the shade of his own mother, Anticlea, whom Odysseus had left alive when he sailed for Troy, and whose presence here told him, with a grief that must have been unbearable, that she had died of sorrow during his long absence, her heart broken not by illness or age, but by the simple, crushing weight of missing her son for so many years without any word of his fate. Odysseus, following Circe's warning, held even his own mother's shade back with his sword until Tiresias had been given the chance to drink first and deliver his prophecy, an act of iron discipline that must have cost him enormously in that moment. At last, the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, approached and drank from the trench of dark blood, and with that drink, his gift of true sight returned to him even in death. What he told Odysseus would shape everything that followed for the rest of the voyage. Tiresias confirmed, first, the source of Odysseus's suffering. It was Poseidon, he said, angry beyond reason because Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was punishing the journey home with storm after storm, delay after delay. Yet the prophet also offered hope. Odysseus and his men could still reach Ithaca, difficult as the road would be, if they exercised one crucial piece of restraint. When they came to the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle and sheep of the sun god Helios grazed, sacred animals, untouched by death and disease, numbering exactly 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep, 50 animals in each, the men must not, under any circumstances, harm a single one. If they left the cattle unharmed, Tiresias promised, Odysseus and his crew, battered and delayed as they might be, would still make it home to Ithaca. But if the men slaughtered even one of Helios's sacred cattle, the prophet warned, Odysseus would lose his ship and every last one of his crew, and would return home eventually, but only alone, many more years later, in a stranger's ship, exactly as Polyphemus had once cursed him to. Tiresias went further still, describing the chaos that awaited Odysseus, even after he reached his own shores, the arrogant suitors who had overrun his palace in his absence, consuming his wealth and courting his wife, whom Odysseus would need to defeat, through cunning or through open force, before his household could ever know peace again. And the prophet added one final, strange instruction, one that lay beyond the boundaries of the story the poem itself would tell. After reclaiming his home, Tiresias said, Odysseus must take up an oar and travel inland, far from any sea, until he reached a place where the people had never tasted salt, never seen a ship, and mistook his oar for a farmer's winnowing tool. There, he was to plant the oar in the earth and make a sacrifice to Poseidon himself, a final act of appeasement to the god whose fury had shaped his entire decade of suffering. And only then would Odysseus finally know a peaceful death in his old age, surrounded by a prosperous and contented people. With the prophecy delivered, Odysseus allowed the other waiting shades to approach and drink, and what followed was one of the most haunting sequences in the entire epic. His mother Anticlea spoke with him at last, describing her death of grief and longing, and when Odysseus reached out 3 times to embrace her, his arms closed on empty air each time, since a shade, however beloved, has no substance for the living to hold. He spoke also with Agamemnon, the high king of the Greeks at Troy, whose shade recounted, with bitter fury, his own murder upon returning home, cut down in his own bath by his wife and her lover, a warning to Odysseus that even a triumphant homecoming from Troy carried no guarantee of safety, and that a man could not simply trust that his own household had remained loyal during his long absence. He spoke too with the shade of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the entire Trojan War, and offered him what he thought would be comforting words, praising the honor and glory Achilles had won in death, ruling now, presumably, as a great lord among the shades. Achilles' answer has echoed down through every century since as one of the most piercing lines in all of Greek literature. He told Odysseus that he would rather be a landless servant to the poorest farmer alive, laboring in the dirt for another man's bread, than be king over all the perished dead. It was a devastating reversal of everything the heroic code of the Iliad had promised, that fame and glory in death were worth more than a long, ordinary life, and it landed on Odysseus, a man whose entire 10-year journey was a desperate fight to preserve his own ordinary, mortal life and return to his ordinary, mortal home, with tremendous weight. Eventually, the crowd of shades grew so vast, and their wailing so overwhelming, that Odysseus, gripped by a fear that even his courage could not entirely master, retreated to his ship, and his crew rowed back across the river of ocean toward the world of the living, carrying with them a prophecy that offered both hope and a very specific, very narrow warning about the dangers still ahead. The sirens, Scylla and Charybdis true to his word, Odysseus returned first to Circe's island, where he and his crew gave the fallen Elpenor the proper funeral rites his shade had begged for, burning his body and raising a mound over his ashes with his oar planted atop it as a marker, exactly as custom demanded. Circe, upon their return, offered Odysseus one final gift before he set out for home in earnest, a detailed briefing on every remaining danger that stood between his ship and Ithaca, a kind of divine map of horrors that Tiresias's prophecy had only sketched in outline. The first danger, Circe explained, would be the sirens, creatures whose enchanted singing lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks surrounding their island, their voices so beautiful and so irresistible that no man who heard them could ever turn his ship away, choosing instead to leap into the sea and swim toward that song, only to be dashed against the rocks or to simply waste away. Forgetting to eat or drink, transfixed forever by the melody until death claimed them where they sat. The shore around the Sirens' Island, Circe warned, was littered with the bleached bones and rotting skin of men who had made that fatal choice before. Odysseus, ever curious and unwilling to sail past a wonder of the world without experiencing it himself, devised a plan that would let him hear the Sirens' legendary song and survive the encounter, the only mortal man ever to do so. He instructed his men to plug their own ears tightly with beeswax, so that not a single note of the sirens' voices could reach them, leaving them free to row on unaffected, no matter what their captain might do or say. Odysseus himself, however, wanted to hear the song, and so he ordered his men to bind him tightly to the ship's mast with heavy rope, and told them explicitly that no matter how he begged, no matter how he pleaded or ordered or threatened, once the siren's song began to work its magic on him, they were not to release him under any circumstances, but only to bind him tighter if he strained against his bonds. The plan worked exactly as intended, and it worked because Odysseus, master strategist that he was, understood something crucial about temptation, that the wisest response to an irresistible urge is not always to trust your own future judgment, but to constrain your own choices in advance while your mind is still clear. As the ship passed the Sirens' Island, their voices rose, praising Odysseus by name, promising him knowledge of all things that had ever happened upon the earth, if only he would come to them. Bound to the mast, Odysseus strained with all his strength against the ropes, weeping, shouting at his men to release him, but his deafened crew, following his own earlier orders exactly, only rowed harder and bound him tighter, until the ship passed safely beyond the reach of that fatal song, and Odysseus alone among all mortal men could say he had heard the sirens sing and lived to tell of it. No sooner had that danger passed than a far more physical and immediate one arose. Circe had warned Odysseus of a narrow strait, guarded on either side by two monstrous perils, and every ship that attempted the passage had to choose which danger to risk. On one side loomed Scylla, a monster with 6 long necks, each ending in a head with rows of razor-sharp teeth, lurking in a cave high in the cliff face, ready to snatch sailors from the decks of passing ships, one victim for each of her 6 mouths. On the other side of the narrow strait churned Charybdis, an enormous whirlpool that swallowed the entire sea 3 times a day and spat it back out again, capable of dragging an entire ship and its full crew down into oblivion in a matter of moments. Circe had been unambiguous in her advice. There was no way to pass both threats unscathed. Attempting to avoid Scylla entirely by steering too close to Charybdis risked losing the whole ship and every man aboard, while hugging the cliffs near Scylla's cave would cost the lives of exactly 6 men, one for each of her grasping heads, but would allow the ship itself and the rest of the crew to survive. It was, in the starkest possible terms, a choice between losing a few and losing everyone, and Circe had counselled Odysseus firmly to accept the smaller certain loss rather than gamble everything against the whirlpool. Odysseus, unable to bring himself to tell his men the full truth of what awaited them, for fear they would abandon their oars in terror, kept Circe's warning about Scylla to himself, and armed himself instead in full battle gear, prepared against Circe's own explicit warning that Scylla was immortal and could not be fought, to at least attempt some kind of resistance when the moment came. As the ship threaded the narrow strait, the crew's attention was fixed with dread on the terrifying spectacle of Charybdis, watching the whirlpool suck down the surrounding water with a roar that echoed off the cliffs, and in that moment of distraction, Scylla struck from above, her 6 necks darting down and snatching 6 of Odysseus's men from the deck, lifting them shrieking and struggling into the air, even as Odysseus watched, helpless, sword drawn but useless, against a monster too fast and too immortal to be fought. It was, Odysseus would later say, the single most painful sight of his entire journey. Watching men who had survived Troy, survived the Cyclops, survived the Laestrygonians, die calling out his name as Scylla carried them off to devour them in her cave. The ship, its numbers thinned once more, sailed on beyond the strait, grieving but alive, carrying its survivors toward the next and most fateful test of the entire voyage, the one danger that even the clearest warning would not be enough to prevent. The cattle of the sun, not long after escaping Scylla and Charybdis, the ship approached the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle and sheep of the sun god Helios, exactly the place both Tiresias and Circe had warned Odysseus about in the most explicit terms possible. Odysseus, remembering the prophet's warning with total clarity, wanted nothing more than to sail past the island entirely, to avoid even the temptation of landing there. But his men, exhausted beyond measure by the relentless string of catastrophes they had already endured, begged him to let them rest on solid ground for even a single night, promising solemnly that they would touch nothing belonging to the sun god, that they carried enough of their own provisions to survive without needing to hunt his sacred herds. Odysseus relented, but only after extracting the most solemn oath he could demand from every man aboard, that none of them would harm so much as a single sheep or head of cattle belonging to Helios while they rested on his island. The men swore, and the ship put in for what was meant to be one peaceful night. That single night became a full month of enforced waiting as the wind, contrary and unrelenting, refused to shift in a direction that would let the ship safely resume its voyage. Odysseus's men, trapped on the island far longer than anyone had anticipated, worked through their own provisions of food, fishing and foraging as best they could, but eventually hunger began to gnaw at them in earnest, a hunger sharper and more desperate than any they had faced since Troy. Odysseus himself, wandering inland one day to pray to the gods for a favourable wind, fell into a deep sleep, and it was in his absence that the fatal breaking point finally came. Eurylochus, the same crewman whose caution had once saved him from Circe's transformation, but whose voice now argued for the opposite extreme, convinced the starving men that death by starvation was a worse fate than any punishment the gods might inflict for slaughtering a few of Helios's cattle, and that even if the sun god was angered, they could always make amends later with a grand temple and rich offerings once they reached home. Persuaded by hunger and by Eurylochus's desperate logic, the men rounded up the finest of Helios's cattle, slaughtered them, and feasted, offering token prayers and burnt portions to the gods, even as they broke the most explicit oath any of them had ever sworn. Odysseus woke from his sleep to the smell of roasting meat and understood immediately, with a despair that must have been total, exactly what his men had done and exactly what it meant for all of them. The signs of divine anger followed almost at once. The flayed hides of the slaughtered cattle were said to have crawled and groaned on the ground as though still alive, and the meat on the spits bellowed even as it cooked, omens of a fury that no amends could now undo. Helios, discovering the slaughter of his beloved herds, went in fury to Zeus himself and demanded justice, threatening that if the men who had killed his cattle were not punished, he would take the sun itself down into the underworld and shine instead among the dead, plunging the entire mortal world into permanent darkness rather than continue to illuminate a world that had allowed his sacred animals to be so violated. Zeus, unwilling to risk such a catastrophe, agreed to punish the guilty men himself. The ship set sail again after 6 more days of feasting, the wind finally turning favourable, but the moment Thrinacia disappeared behind them and open water surrounded the ship on all sides, Zeus unleashed his vengeance. A sudden, violent storm rose without warning, and a bolt of lightning struck the ship directly, splitting it apart, snapping the mast, and hurling every man aboard into the raging sea. Every single one of Odysseus's remaining crew drowned in that instant, swept away and lost. The entire company of men who had sailed with him from Troy through the Cicons and the Lotus Eaters, past the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians, through Circe's enchantments and the halls of the dead, past the Sirens and the jaws of Scylla, gone in the span of a single storm, the direct and total fulfillment of Tiresias's warning about what would happen if the cattle of the sun were ever harmed. Odysseus alone survived, clinging to the broken wreckage of his own ship's keel and mast, lashed together with a length of rope into a makeshift raft. The winds, cruelly, carried him back toward the very strait he had so recently and so painfully escaped, back toward Charybdis itself, and he was forced to watch in horror as the whirlpool began to swallow his makeshift raft, saving himself only by leaping up and clinging with his bare hands to an overhanging fig tree growing from the cliff face above, hanging there in agony, arms straining. Until Charybdis finally spat his raft back out from below, at which point he dropped back down onto the wreckage and paddled away with his hands, having survived by nothing but desperate improvisation and sheer will. The very death Circe had once warned would claim any ship that sailed too close to that whirlpool. For 9 days, Odysseus drifted alone across the open sea, without food, without a crew, without a single companion left alive from the fleet of 12 ships that had once sailed from Troy. On the 10th day, exhausted beyond description, grieving every man who had died under his command, he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home to the nymph Calypso, where the next long chapter of his suffering, quieter than what had come before, but no less painful in its own way, was about to begin. Calypso and the island of Ogygia was, by every account, a place of extraordinary beauty. Thick forests of alder and poplar and fragrant cypress grew around the mouth of a great cave, its entrance twined with a soft, cultivated grapevine heavy with clusters of fruit. 4 separate springs ran clear and close together nearby, feeding meadows lush with violets and wild celery, a landscape so lovely that even a visiting god, it was said, might pause in wonder at the sight of it. And it was here, half drowned and utterly alone, that Odysseus washed ashore, the sole survivor of his entire fleet. Calypso, the nymph who ruled this island, found him and took him in, nursing him back to health, and in time, falling deeply and genuinely in love with him. She was no monster, no schemer in the mould of Circe, at least not at first. Her feelings for Odysseus appear, in every telling, to have been sincere, and she offered him something no other figure in the entire story would ever offer: immortality itself, an eternal life at her side on this beautiful, isolated island, free from age, free from further suffering, free from the storms and monsters and grieving losses that had defined every year of his journey so far. It was, in its own way, the most powerful temptation Odysseus faced in the entire epic, more dangerous in some respects than the lotus, because it was not offered through trickery or drugged food, but as a genuine, freely given gift, wrapped in real affection and backed by the almost unimaginable promise of never having to die at all. And Odysseus, for a time, accepted it. He remained on Ogygia for 7 long years, sharing Calypso's bed, living in her comfort, a guest turned companion turned, in every meaningful sense, a prisoner of paradise. Because for all her genuine feeling, and for all the island's real beauty, Calypso would not let him leave. Odysseus spent those 7 years, by the poem's own account, weeping on the shore each day, staring out across the water toward a home he had no ship and no way to reach, his heart entirely elsewhere, even as his body remained trapped in a place most mortals would have called heaven. It captures something profound about the nature of home and longing, that no comfort, no beauty, no even the promise of eternal life could substitute for the specific, irreplaceable pull of one's own wife, one's own son, one's own rocky little island kingdom. It took the direct intervention of the gods themselves to finally free him. On Mount Olympus, with Poseidon conveniently away visiting a distant land, the goddess Athena, who had championed Odysseus's cause since the days of the Trojan War, and who could not openly act while Poseidon's anger still burned so fiercely, pleaded his case before Zeus and the assembled gods. She argued that Odysseus had suffered enough, that his cleverness and his devotion to his wife and son deserved better than eternal captivity on a nymph's island, no matter how comfortable that captivity might appear from the outside. Zeus agreed and dispatched Hermes, messenger of the gods, to fly down to Ogygia and inform Calypso, in no uncertain terms, that the gods had decreed Odysseus must be released. Calypso, though heartbroken, and though she pointed out with some bitterness that the gods seemed to resent any goddess who dared to love a mortal man openly, while indulging their own countless affairs freely, obeyed the divine command. She helped Odysseus build a raft, provided him with tools, timber, cloth for a sail, and stores of food, wine, and water for the voyage, and even offered him, one final time, the choice to stay and become immortal at her side. Odysseus, remarkably, chose mortality. He chose Penelope, a wife who by now had aged during his absence, over a goddess who could never age at all. He chose the difficulty and uncertainty of an ordinary human life, with its guaranteed end, over an eternity of ease with someone who was not, in the end, the person he wanted to grow old beside. It remains one of the most quietly powerful decisions in the entire epic. A hero choosing his real, imperfect, mortal home over paradise itself. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed his makeshift raft alone across open water, guided by the stars, following Calypso's careful instructions to keep the constellation of the Great Bear always on his left. On the 18th day, land finally came into view, the misty mountains of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians. And it was at that exact moment, when safety seemed almost within reach, that Poseidon, returning from his travels and spotting his old enemy so close to salvation, was overcome with fresh fury. Poseidon summoned a devastating storm, whipping the sea into chaos, shattering Odysseus's raft into splinters and hurling him into the churning water. For 2 full days and nights, Odysseus struggled to stay afloat in that merciless sea, saved at one critical moment by the sea goddess Ino, who took pity on the exhausted, half-drowned man and gave him a magical veil to wrap around his chest, a charm that kept him from sinking even as the waves battered him without mercy. Athena, too, intervened where she could, calming certain of the currents and guiding him, exhausted almost past the point of survival, toward the mouth of a river on the Phaeacian coast. There, at last, Odysseus dragged himself onto dry land, collapsed beneath a thicket of olive bushes for shelter from the wind, and fell into a sleep of total, overwhelming exhaustion, naked, alone, and utterly without possessions, save for the sheer force of will that had kept him alive through everything the sea had thrown at him. The Phaeacians and Princess Nausicaa Odysseus woke the next morning to the sound of young women laughing and playing near the riverbank, and it was there that he encountered Nausicaa, the young and unmarried princess of the Phaeacians, daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The night before, Athena had appeared to Nausicaa in a dream, disguised as a friend, urging her to visit the river the following day to wash her family's fine linens in preparation, the dream suggested, for her own eventual marriage, a subtle piece of divine matchmaking meant to place the princess exactly where the shipwrecked Odysseus would wash ashore. When Odysseus emerged from the bushes, naked, salt-crusted, and wild with exhaustion, Nausicaa's handmaidens fled in terror at the sight of him. Nausicaa alone stood her ground, and it is a testament to both her own courage and to the sacred Greek principle of hospitality towards strangers that she did not turn him away. Odysseus, drawing on every ounce of diplomatic charm that had once helped him survive years of war and negotiation, approached her with careful, respectful words, comparing her beauty to a young palm tree he had once seen, praising her without any hint of threat, and asking humbly for clothing and directions to the city. Nausicaa was moved by his eloquence and his evident suffering, and she not only gave him clothes from the laundry and food and drink, but personally guided him toward her father's city, though she was careful, mindful of gossip, to have Odysseus follow at a distance so that no one would assume any impropriety between the shipwrecked stranger and the unmarried princess. She advised him exactly how to approach her mother, Queen Arete, when he reached the palace, since it was Arete's favour, more than anyone else's, that determined whether a stranger received the kingdom's help. Odysseus followed her advice precisely, and when he entered the great hall of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, wrapped in a divine mist that Athena had cast over him to keep him from being troubled before he could plead his case, he threw himself as a suppliant at Arete's knees. His words moved the entire court. Alcinous welcomed him with full royal hospitality, promising, as was customary, to grant the stranger safe passage home, though he did not yet know who this ragged, eloquent visitor truly was. Odysseus remained among the Phaeacians for several days, honoured as a guest, invited to compete in their athletic games, where he ultimately proved his strength and prowess despite lingering exhaustion, silencing a young Phaeacian noble who had mocked him as unfit for competition. At a grand feast, the blind court poet Demodocus sang of the Trojan War, and when he reached the tale of the wooden horse and the sack of Troy, Odysseus, listening, could not contain his grief, and wept openly, hiding his face beneath his cloak. Alcinous noticed the stranger's tears, and, with the tact of a good host, gently asked him at last to reveal his true identity and the story of everything that had happened to him since the war's end. It was in the great hall of the Phaeacians, then, that Odysseus finally told his own story from beginning to end. The Cicones, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, and Calypso, the entire sweeping account of everything he had survived, moving his listeners to tears and astonishment in equal measure. Deeply impressed, and perhaps a little awed to have been hosting the legendary Saga of Troy without knowing it, Alcinous and the Phaeacians outfitted a ship of their own to carry him home at last, loading it with treasures far beyond what he had lost in his shipwrecks, gifts of bronze and gold and fine woven cloth that would have made him, on his return, a wealthy man even without his own kingdom. The Phaeacians were renowned, above almost anything else, for the speed and magic of their ships. Vessels that required no pilot, that knew every man's destination as though by instinct, and that skimmed across the water faster than any hawk in flight. True to that reputation, the ship carrying Odysseus crossed the sea in a single night, and while he slept, deeply and peacefully for the first time perhaps in years, the Phaeacian sailors carried him ashore on the coast of Ithaca itself, laid him gently on the sand along with all his treasure, and departed before he even woke. It was an act of extraordinary hospitality on the Phaeacians' part, and it would cost them dearly. Poseidon, furious that the Phaeacians had defied him and safely delivered his enemy home despite every storm he had raised against him, turned the returning ship to solid stone as it approached its own harbour in sight of the entire watching city, and threatened, according to an old prophecy Alcenius remembered too late, to one day wall off their harbour entirely with a great mountain, cutting the seafaring Phaeacians off from the ocean that had always been the source of their wealth and their pride. It was Poseidon's final act of vengeance in the story, a punishment delivered not to Odysseus himself, who was finally, after 10 long years, safely and unmistakably home, but to the last people generous enough to help him get there. For 20 years, 10 spent at the war in Troy, and 10 more spent wandering the seas, Odysseus had been gone from Ithaca. And while he suffered and struggled and lost every single man who had once sailed under his command, an entirely different story, quieter, but every bit as difficult, had been unfolding back on his own island, where a wife and a son waited, and where an island full of greedy, arrogant men had begun to circle his empty throne like wolves scenting a wound. Penelope and the suitors, while Odysseus fought for his life against monsters and gods across the wine-dark sea, his wife Penelope faced a very different kind of siege. One fought not with boulders and whirlpools, but with pressure, manipulation, and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. By the time the events of our story properly resume in Ithaca, nearly 20 years had passed since Odysseus first sailed for Troy, and for most of that time, no word of his fate had ever reached his home. He had simply vanished into the war, and then into the wider silence of the sea, leaving behind a wife who did not know whether she was still married or already a widow. Into that uncertainty poured over 100 suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, all of them eager to claim not only the hand of a queen still renowned for her beauty and her wisdom, but the wealth, the land, and the throne that came attached to her, assuming that Odysseus must surely be dead after so many years without word. They took up residence in Odysseus's own palace, uninvited, uncontrolled, and effectively unstoppable, since Penelope had no army of her own to drive them out, and her son Telemachus was still too young and too unsupported to challenge over 100 armed men by himself. The suitors' behaviour was, by every ancient Greek standard, a grotesque violation of the sacred laws of hospitality. The very same laws Odysseus himself had once appealed to in the cave of the Cyclops. Guests were meant to be modest, grateful, and mindful of their host's resources. The suitors, instead, treated Odysseus's palace as their own personal feasting hall, slaughtering his cattle and sheep and pigs by the dozens, drinking his wine by the barrel, day after day, month after month, year after year. Quite literally eating Telemachus's inheritance out from under him, while they waited for Penelope to finally choose one of them as her new husband. Penelope, for her part, refused to give in, employing a patience and a cunning that, in its own way, matched her husband's legendary cleverness step for step. Pressured relentlessly by the suitors to select a new husband and end the standoff, she devised a delaying tactic that has become one of the most celebrated examples of quiet resistance in all of literature. She announced that she could not remarry until she had finished weaving a burial shroud for her aging father-in-law, Laertes, Odysseus's own father, a task any dutiful daughter-in-law would be expected to complete before turning her attention to a new marriage. The suitors, unable to object to such a reasonable and pious excuse, agreed to wait. What they did not know, for nearly 3 full years, was that Penelope worked at her loom by day, weaving the shroud in plain sight of the entire household, and then crept back to the loom each night by torchlight and secretly unravelled every thread she had woven, undoing an entire day's labour in the darkness so that the shroud would never actually near completion, buying herself month after month after month of additional time, all while giving every outward appearance of diligent, faithful progress. It was, in miniature, an act of exactly the kind of patient, disciplined deception that Odysseus himself practiced on a grander scale across the sea, husband and wife unknowingly mirroring each other's cleverness across a distance of thousands of miles and many years apart. The trick was eventually exposed after nearly 3 years, betrayed by one of Penelope's own household maids, who had grown disloyal and had begun secretly favouring the suitors, revealing the queen's secret to Antinous, the most arrogant and aggressive of all the suitors camped in her hall. Caught in her deception, Penelope was forced to finally complete the shroud, and the pressure to remarry, already immense, grew sharper and more dangerous with every passing month after that. Antinous, in particular, emerges from this part of the story as something close to a villain in his own right, a man who blamed Penelope openly for the entire standoff, accusing her of stringing the suitors along for her own advantage while they wasted their finest years and their own resources courting her, rather than acknowledging any fault in the suitors' own greed and their willingness to occupy another man's home indefinitely. It was Antinous, too, who would later hatch the darkest plot yet, a conspiracy to ambush and kill Telemachus himself, Odysseus's only son and heir, the moment word reached Ithaca that the young prince had set out to sea in search of news about his missing father, a plot born from the fear that if Telemachus succeeded in finding real information, or worse, if he grew into a man capable of reclaiming his father's throne by force, the suitor's entire scheme would collapse. Penelope, caught between an empty throne, a household being devoured before her eyes, over 100 aggressive suitors, and a son now sailing into potential danger on her behalf, endured all of this not with despair, though grief certainly touched her deeply and often, but with a kind of steady, watchful faithfulness that never once wavered in its underlying conviction that her husband was still alive and that he would, somehow, someday, find his way home to her. Telemachus and the journey to Pylos and Sparta, at the very moment our larger story properly begins, with Odysseus still trapped on Calypso's island. His son Telemachus was a young man grown to maturity entirely in his father's absence, having been only an infant when Odysseus first sailed for Troy 2 decades earlier. He had never truly known his father, only stories and an aching, uncertain hope, and he had grown up watching his own inheritance devoured by strangers, powerless, by his own admission, to do anything meaningful about it. It was the goddess Athena, Odysseus's most devoted champion among the immortals, who finally set events in motion. Disguised as an old family friend named Mentes, a role she would later reprise under the name Mentor, the origin, in fact, of that very word in our own language, Athena appeared to Telemachus and gently prodded him toward action. She assured him that his father was not dead, but alive and being held against his will somewhere far away, and she urged him toward 2 concrete steps. First, to call a formal assembly of the men of Ithaca and publicly confront the suitors over their outrageous behaviour, demanding they leave his father's house. Second, and more importantly for the story that follows, to set sail himself. To the courts of Pylos and Sparta, where 2 of his father's old comrades from the Trojan War, King Nestor and King Menelaus, might have news of what became of Odysseus after the fall of Troy. Telemachus, until this point in his life a somewhat passive and uncertain young man, found in Athena's encouragement the first real spark of the king he would eventually become. He called the assembly as instructed, and in front of the gathered men of Ithaca gave voice for the first time to the full scope of his grievance, describing openly how the suitors were consuming his father's estate and disgracing his mother's honor. The suitors, led by the same arrogant Antinous, dismissed his complaints with contempt, blaming Penelope's own delaying tactics for the impasse and refusing to leave. But the assembly did produce one striking omen. As Telemachus finished speaking, 2 eagles appeared overhead, locked in violent combat, and an elder among the Ithacans, a seer named Halitherses, interpreted the sign as proof that Odysseus was in fact near, and that his return would mean death for every suitor who refused to leave his hall. The suitors laughed off the warning, certain in their arrogance that no army of ghosts or eagles could touch them. With Athena's help, and in secrecy, so that the suitors could not intercept him, Telemachus gathered a crew and a ship and set sail for Pylos, the kingdom of the aged King Nestor, one of the most respected of all the surviving Greek commanders from the war. Nestor received the young prince warmly, and though he had no direct news of Odysseus's specific fate, since the 2 men had parted ways in a storm of disagreement shortly after the fall of Troy, he told Telemachus at length about the fates of the other Greek commanders, and in particular about the tragic story of Agamemnon, murdered by his own wife and her lover upon his return home, and about how Agamemnon's son, Orestes, had eventually avenged his father's death by killing the murderers in turn. The story was not simply background color, it was a pointed and deliberate parallel meant to sharpen Telemachus's own resolve, showing him a mirror of his own situation, a son whose father's household had been invaded and betrayed in his absence, and a son who ultimately found the courage to act rather than wait passively for fate to resolve itself. Nestor, recognizing the value of the lesson, sent Telemachus onward to Sparta with his own son as a traveling companion to visit King Menelaus, who might know more of Odysseus's whereabouts than anyone else, since Menelaus himself had wandered far and wide, even as far as Egypt, before finally reaching home with Helen at his side. In Sparta, Telemachus found Menelaus and Helen living in restored, if quietly uneasy, harmony after the entire catastrophe their affair, or abduction, depending on which version of that old story one believed, had unleashed upon the world. Menelaus, delighted to host the son of his old comrade, shared the most concrete news Telemachus had yet received. During his own long journey home from Troy, Menelaus explained he had been stranded on the island of Pharos near Egypt and had been forced to wrestle and interrogate a shape-shifting sea god named Proteus in order to learn how to continue his own voyage. In the course of that struggle, Proteus had revealed to him the fates of several other Greek heroes, and among them he confirmed that Odysseus was alive, though trapped, weeping, upon the island of a nymph named Calypso, unable to leave for lack of a ship or crew. For Telemachus, this was the confirmation he had travelled so far and so dangerously to obtain. His father was not dead. He was alive, if imprisoned, somewhere far across the sea, and there was, at long last, real reason to hope for his return. Yet even as this news reached him, danger was gathering back home. Word had reached Ithaca of Telemachus's voyage, and the suitors, led by Antinous, furious and frightened by the prospect of the young prince returning with allies, information, or simply the confidence of a man who had proven he could act rather than merely endure, plotted to ambush his ship on its return journey and kill him before he could ever reach his mother's hall again. It was only through Athena's continued intervention, warning both Telemachus of the ambush waiting for him and guiding his ship along an alternate route home, that the young prince avoided sailing directly into a trap that would have ended his story, and quite possibly his father's entire legacy, before either of them ever had the chance to meet again. As Telemachus's ship slipped quietly back toward Ithaca along a hidden path, his father, unbeknownst to him, had at that very moment finally washed ashore on their home island's own coast. Carried there in the night by the swift and silent ships of the Phaeacians. Father and son, after 20 years and thousands of miles of separate suffering, were, for the very first time since Telemachus was a babe in arms, finally on the very same patch of earth. The beggar's return Odysseus woke on the shore of Ithaca, not knowing, at first, where he was. Athena, ever watchful, had wrapped the coastline in a concealing mist, so that even the returning hero did not immediately recognize the shape of the land that had haunted his every waking thought for 20 years. When she finally appeared to him and revealed the truth that he had indeed reached home at last, Odysseus wept. And then, with the same caution and cunning that had carried him through every previous ordeal, he did not rush toward his own palace gates. He understood immediately, with Athena's guidance confirming his instinct, that walking into his own hall as himself, an aging, travel-worn stranger claiming to be the long-lost king, surrounded by over 100 armed and hostile suitors, would very likely get him killed before he ever had the chance to reclaim anything at all. So Athena, in an act of transformation as thorough as anything Circe had ever managed, disguised Odysseus as an elderly, ragged beggar, withering his skin, thinning his hair, dulling the brightness of his eyes, and dressing him in filthy, tattered clothing, so that not even his own household would recognize the king beneath the disguise. Before sending him toward his own home, she instructed him to first seek out Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, a servant who had remained faithful to Odysseus's memory throughout the entire 20 years of his absence, tending the royal pigs on the outskirts of the estate with a devotion that had never wavered even as the rest of the household descended into chaos. Eumaeus, not recognizing the disguised king before him, welcomed the ragged stranger with exactly the kind of generous hospitality that the suitors, back at the palace, had so thoroughly abandoned, sharing his own modest meal, offering him a place to sleep, and speaking at length, with real grief in his voice, about his missing master, whom he still believed, against all evidence, and against the suitor's confident assumptions, might somehow still be alive. It was, for Odysseus, a profoundly moving experience, to sit disguised in his own household and hear firsthand just how deeply his absence had been felt by those who had remained loyal to him, even as he had to bite back the urge to reveal himself immediately. It was at Eumaeus's humble hut that father and son finally crossed paths again. Telemachus, having evaded the suitor's ambush and returned safely to Ithaca, went first to see Eumaeus rather than risk the suitor's hall directly, and there he found the ragged beggar his loyal swineherd had taken in. Athena, at the crucial moment, restored Odysseus's true appearance, briefly and privately, transforming him back from the withered old beggar into the strong, kingly man he truly was, right before his son's astonished eyes. Telemachus, understandably, could not at first believe what he was seeing, assuming this transformation must be the work of some god playing a trick on him, until Odysseus finally, tearfully, confirmed that he was indeed his father, home at last after 20 years. Their reunion was one of profound emotion, both men weeping openly, embracing after a lifetime spent apart, Telemachus having grown from an infant into a young man entirely, without his father's presence or guidance. But there was little time to simply savor the moment. Odysseus, ever the strategist even in his joy, immediately began planning with his son how to reclaim their home and defeat the suitors who had occupied it for so long. He instructed Telemachus to return to the palace ahead of him and behave as though nothing had changed, giving no hint to anyone, not even to Penelope herself, that Odysseus had returned. Since secrecy remained their greatest advantage against 100 armed men, he also gave Telemachus a crucial, practical instruction to quietly remove the weapons that normally hung on the walls of the Great Hall, under the pretext of keeping them safe from smoke damage, so that when the moment for confrontation finally arrived, the suitors would find themselves unarmed and vulnerable. Odysseus himself, still disguised as the elderly beggar, made his own way to the palace shortly afterward, entering his own home for the first time in 20 years, not as a returning king, but as an object of scorn and casual cruelty from the very men who had spent years consuming his wealth and courting his wife. It was here, at the threshold of his own hall, that one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire epic took place. Lying neglected on a pile of dung near the gate was Argos, Odysseus's own hunting dog, now old and flea-ridden and abandoned, a puppy full of promise when his master had sailed for Troy 2 decades earlier. Despite the total transformation of the disguise, despite 20 years of separation, Argos recognized his master instantly, his ears lifting, his tail attempting one final, feeble wag. And then, having waited faithfully for that one last glimpse of his true owner, the old dog died. His long vigil finally, peacefully, over, Odysseus, forced to maintain his disguise even in this moment of private grief, could only wipe away a tear in secret. Unable to openly mourn the one soul in his entire household whose loyalty had never once wavered. Inside the hall, Odysseus, still disguised, endured the suitors' contempt and abuse with remarkable restraint, absorbing insults, having food and even a footstool hurled at him by the most arrogant among them, all while quietly observing the layout of the hall, the character of each suitor, and the loyalties of the surviving household staff, gathering exactly the intelligence he would need for what was coming. Penelope, informed of an interesting beggar claiming to have news of her husband, summoned him to speak with her directly, and in a long and careful conversation, Odysseus, still unrecognized by his own wife, told her a fabricated but convincing tale of having met Odysseus during his travels, assuring her that he was alive and would return home soon, all while carefully never revealing his own true identity, even as something in her seemed to sense, without quite being able to name it, an unusual familiarity in this stranger's manner. It was during this same visit that Odysseus was very nearly exposed by accident. Euryclea, his old and beloved childhood nurse, was tasked with washing the beggar's feet as an act of hospitality, and as her hands moved along his leg, she felt, and instantly recognized, an old and distinctive scar above his knee, a wound Odysseus had received as a young man during a boar hunt many years before. Euryclea gasped, nearly crying out his name in shock and joy, and Odysseus, moving with the speed and urgency of a man whose entire plan hung in the balance, seized her by the throat and swore her to absolute secrecy. A demand she honored, understanding immediately the danger that premature discovery would pose, not just to Odysseus, but to Penelope and Telemachus as well. The contest of the bow Penelope, whether guided by some instinct she could not fully name or simply worn down by years of relentless pressure, finally announced the decision the suitors had been waiting years to hear. She would hold a contest, she declared, and whichever suitor could accomplish a specific, formidable feat would win her hand in marriage at last. The challenge involved Odysseus's own great bow, a weapon so powerful that no ordinary man could even string it, let alone fire it accurately. The winning suitor would need to string that bow and then shoot a single arrow cleanly through the aligned sockets of 12 axe heads set up in a row, a feat that, as far as anyone in the hall knew, only Odysseus himself had ever managed to accomplish. It is worth pausing to appreciate the layered brilliance of this moment, because Penelope's choice of contest was, whether by conscious design or by some deeper unconscious loyalty to her husband's memory, a test that essentially guaranteed only the true Odysseus, or a man of truly extraordinary strength and skill, could ever win her hand. In effect, she had set a trial that no ordinary suitor could pass, buying herself, once again, more time, even as she genuinely believed, by this point, that she might finally need to choose a new husband from among the men who had occupied her home for so long. One by one, the suitors attempted to string the great bow, and one by one, they failed, straining and struggling, some warming the wood over a fire in a desperate attempt to make it more pliable, all without success. Antinous, ever proud, suggested postponing the contest until the following day, hoping the god of wine might inspire greater luck, an excuse that thinly disguised his own embarrassment at failing the task himself. It was at this point that the disguised beggar, still sitting quietly among the household's lowest ranks, asked, with careful humility, whether he too might be permitted to attempt the bow. The suitors mocked him savagely, certain that an old vagrant had no business touching a weapon that had defeated the finest young nobleman of the region. But Telemachus, following the plan he and his father had quietly arranged, insisted that the beggar be given his turn. Asserting his own authority as the master of the house in his father's continued absence, and over the suitor's outrage, the great bow was placed in Odysseus's hands. What followed was a moment of pure, quiet triumph, rendered all the more powerful by how effortlessly Odysseus accomplished what every suitor in the hall had just failed to do. He examined the bow carefully, checking it for any damage in his long absence, and then, with the same easy familiarity a skilled musician might show in stringing a lyre, he strung the great bow in a single fluid motion. The string, drawn taut for the first time in 20 years, gave off a clear, ringing note, like the cry of a swallow, an omen so sudden and so striking that even the mocking suitors fell silent. Odysseus then nocked an arrow, drew the bowstring back, and fired a single shot cleanly through all 12 axe heads, without so much as grazing their sockets, a feat of precision that confirmed, to anyone still paying attention, exactly who this ragged beggar truly was. The slaughter of the suitors there was no pause for celebration. The moment his arrow found its mark, Odysseus threw off his beggar's rags, revealing himself at last, in his own hall, before the very men who had spent years devouring his wealth and courting his wife. Standing at the threshold with Telemachus at his side, the weapons already quietly removed from the walls exactly as they had planned, Odysseus turned the bow on the suitors themselves, and his first arrow found Antinous, striking him through the throat just as he raised a golden cup to drink, killing the most arrogant and most dangerous of all the suitors before he even understood what was happening. Chaos erupted through the hall. The suitors, unarmed and caught entirely by surprise, scrambled desperately for weapons that were no longer where they expected them to be, while Odysseus, joined now by Telemachus, the loyal swineherd Eumaeus, and a loyal cowherd named Philoetius, all four fighting together with Athena's own unseen guidance, strengthening their arms and clouding the suitors' aim, methodically cut down every single man who had occupied their home. Some of the suitors begged for mercy, offering to repay everything they had consumed 100-fold, blaming their fellows for leading them astray, but Odysseus, whose fury after 20 years of exile and loss could not be so easily bought off, showed no leniency to men who had spent years trying to steal his wife, his son's inheritance, and his very kingdom out from under him. By the time the fighting ended, every suitor who had occupied the halls of Odysseus lay dead upon the floor of his own great hall. Odysseus dealt harshly, too, with the members of his own household staff who had proven disloyal during his absence, servants who had sided openly with the suitors, or who had betrayed their true master's household while he was away, a grim and uncompromising final act of restoring order to a house that had been allowed to fall into total corruption over 20 long years. Reunion with Penelope. Word of the suitors' slaughter reached Penelope, who had been sleeping upstairs, entirely unaware that the beggar she had spoken with only days before had, in fact, been her own husband all along. Even now, informed that Odysseus himself stood in the hall below, having killed every suitor who had plagued their household, Penelope, did not rush down in blind faith. 20 years of uncertainty, of clever men and false promises, had taught her a caution every bit as sharp as her husband's own famous wariness, and she was determined not to be fooled by an impostor, however convincing his claims might be. She descended to the hall and studied the man before her carefully, saying little, testing him in silence, to the visible frustration of Telemachus, who could not understand why his mother would not simply embrace the father he had waited his entire life to know. Odysseus, recognizing and even respecting his wife's caution as a mirror of his own careful nature, did not demand her immediate acceptance. Instead, Penelope devised one final test, quietly instructing a servant to move the bed from their marital chamber outside into the hall so that Odysseus might sleep there that night. It was the perfect trap, because Odysseus, hearing this instruction, reacted with genuine and immediate alarm, explaining that such a task was impossible, since he himself had built that very bed many years ago around the living trunk of an ancient olive tree that grew rooted permanently in the ground, carving the tree itself into one of the bedposts and building the entire bedroom around it. A bed that could never be moved without destroying it entirely. A secret known only to the two of them and to a single trusted servant. Hearing this detail, a fact that no impostor, however skilled at deception, could possibly have known, Penelope's composure finally broke. She rushed to Odysseus at last, weeping, and embraced her husband for the first time in 20 years. The two of them finally, fully reunited, after a war and a decade of wandering had kept them apart for the better part of their entire adult lives. It is one of the most tender and most quietly triumphant moments in the entire epic, a reunion earned not through force or magic, but through a shared, private history that no disguise and no amount of time could ever erase. Peace restored in Ithaca. The story does not end quite there, however, because the deaths of over 100 suitors, sons of prominent and powerful families across Ithaca and the surrounding islands, could not simply be forgotten or forgiven without consequence. Odysseus first travelled to see his aging father, Laertes, who had withdrawn from the palace entirely during the years of the suitor's occupation, living out his grief and his shame on a modest farm. Refusing to set foot in a hall he no longer considered his own. Their reunion was tender and cautious in its own right, Odysseus initially testing his father with a false story before finally revealing his true identity through the memory of childhood details only a true son could know, including the specific trees his father had once given him as gifts in his boyhood. But even as father and son embraced, the families of the slain suitors, grieving and furious, gathered an armed force intent on avenging their sons and brothers, marching toward Laertes' farm with the intention of killing Odysseus in turn and ending the conflict through further bloodshed. What might otherwise have spiraled into an endless cycle of vengeance, the very kind of generational bloodshed that had consumed the house of Agamemnon, was ultimately halted by direct divine intervention. Athena herself appeared, and at Zeus's own command, she compelled the two sides to lay down their weapons, imposing a lasting peace on Ithaca by decree of the gods themselves, a peace that could not be earned through further combat, but only granted, finally, by intervention from above. And so, after 20 years, 10 spent fighting at Troy, and 10 more spent wandering across a hostile sea marked by monsters, witches, gods, and grief beyond measure, Odysseus was restored fully to his home. His wife stood beside him once more. His son had grown, in his absence, into a capable young man who had fought at his father's side in the very hall where he was born. His father lived to see his son's return, and Ithaca, after years of chaos and corruption, finally knew peace again under the rule of the king whose cleverness, whose endurance, and whose unbreakable longing for home had carried him through every trial the sea and its gods could devise. reflections on the journey it is worth stepping back, now that the story has run its full course, to consider what has actually been carried across these 20 years and these thousands of miles of open water. Nearly every god of real consequence in Greek mythology touches this story at some point, and each one shapes it in a distinct way. Poseidon stands as the story's great antagonist, a god whose wrath, born from a father's love for his wounded son, follows Odysseus across every wave of the journey, proof that even a hero as clever as Odysseus cannot simply outthink the fury of an Olympian. Athena, by contrast, stands as his great protector, a goddess whose admiration for Odysseus's intelligence and resourcefulness leads her to intervene again and again, disguising him, guiding his son, calming storms where she can, and finally imposing the peace that allows his story to end in harmony rather than endless bloodshed. Zeus presides above both of them, weighing the competing claims of vengeance and mercy, ultimately allowing Odysseus's suffering to run its appointed course, while still, in the end, permitting his homecoming. Hermes appears at crucial junctures as a genuine helper, delivering the herb that saves Odysseus from Circe's enchantment and carrying the command that finally frees him from Calypso's island. Circe and Calypso, though very different in temperament, both represent the same underlying temptation, the offer of comfort, pleasure, or even immortality itself, in exchange for abandoning the harder, more painful path home. And Helios, wounded by the loss of his sacred cattle, reminds us that even gods far removed from the central conflict of the story can shape a mortal's fate profoundly, when that mortal's own companions prove too weak to resist temptation. Beneath all of that divine machinery, though, the Odyssey remains, at its heart, a deeply human story, built around themes that have not lost a single ounce of their power in the nearly 3,000 years since they were first sung aloud around ancient hearths. It is a story about perseverance, about a man who loses everything, his entire fleet, every single companion who sailed with him from Troy, and still refuses to stop moving toward home. It is a story about cleverness, about the specific, quintessentially human power of the mind to outmatch brute strength, whether that means tricking a cyclops with a false name, resisting a siren's song through careful preparation rather than willpower alone, or devising a bow contest clever enough to filter out every false suitor from the one true husband. It is a story about hospitality, about the sacred, fragile trust that once bound stranger to stranger in the ancient world, honoured beautifully by figures like Eumaeus and the Phaeacians, and violated grotesquely by the suitors who occupied Odysseus's home. It is a story about fate, about a prophecy delivered in the underworld that shapes every choice that follows, and about how even foreknowledge of danger cannot always prevent it when human weakness enters the equation. It is a story about loyalty, embodied not only in Penelope's 20 years of quiet resistance, but in a swineherd's devotion, an old nurse's discretion, and even, most heartbreakingly, in an aging dog's final act of recognition before death. It is a story about temptation, about lotus fruit and enchanted feasts, and the promise of eternal life, and about the harder, more painful choice to keep moving towards something real rather than settling for something easy. And above everything else, it is a story about the longing for home, an ache so powerful that it could keep a man rowing through storms, wrestling monsters, and refusing immortality itself, all for the simple, singular hope of walking through his own front door one more time. 20 years is a long time to wait, whether you are the one wandering or the one left behind, weaving and unweaving a shroud by candlelight, watching the horizon for a sail that never seems to come. But the story of Odysseus and Penelope, of Telemachus finding his courage, and of a household finally restored, tells us something true about the nature of hope itself, that it can survive absence, survive rumour, survive even the most persuasive arguments to simply move on and let go. Sometimes, against every reasonable expectation that hope is finally, quietly rewarded. That is where we leave Ithaca tonight, at peace at last, its king home, its queen no longer waiting, its long, aching silence finally broken. If you enjoyed tonight's journey across the wine-dark sea, please consider leaving a like, and if you are new here, consider subscribing so you never miss the next story. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with me. Sleep well wherever you are listening from tonight, and I will see you next time. Good night.